In 1979, although Microsoft wasn't the giant that they are known as now, Bill Gates was firmly setting the stage, with Microsoft Basic already licensed by Apple, IBM, Tandy, and Commodore in their respective machines. And Microsoft would be interested in making games, so they established the Microsoft Consumer Products Division. While not something that had any long-term success, the division was responsible for contracting Bruce Artwick to create the first Microsoft Flight Simulator game. Near the end of 1979, Microsoft Consumer Products Division would release Microsoft Adventure, initially for the Tandy TRS-80 home computer, and later on, ports to the IBM PC and Apple II. Microsoft Adventure is a text-based adventure game that is a port of Colossal Cave Adventure, which was originally developed by William Crowther and Don Woods. Colossal Cave released in 1976, and it's a text-based adventure game that sets the player to explore a cave full of treasures with the goal to earn the most number of treasures and survive. In 1977, Don Woods would expand the game, and the original Colossal Cave Adventure released on the DEC PDP-10 mainframe, and is considered the first ever adventure game. The game itself is known as a work of interactive fiction that uses text to tell the story. The game parser accepts two-words commands, such as get lamp, go south, or enter cave. The game describes in text the player's location and the responses to the actions that they have taken. Microsoft Adventure then would be the first complete home port of Colossal Cave, the entire mainframe release running on a home computer, the Tandy TRS-80. This would be a very big deal at the time because in the same way as home ports of arcade games later on, a mainframe game running on a home computer with just 32 kilobytes of RAM would not be trivial. The original game ran in Fortran and was ported to Z80 assembly, and the man behind the port would be Gordon Letwin. Letwin would let Microsoft know that he was more than capable of porting Colossal Cave Adventure to the Tandy TRS-80. Attempting to fit the entire game in RAM would not be an option, so Letwin would take advantage of the floppy disk drive in the TRS-80 to only load parts of the game as needed, essentially streaming in data as required and using it effectively as virtual memory. This method, while certainly not patented, would be used in many games that came later on. As a result, the game released exclusively on a single 5¼ floppy disk, which was unique at the time because many home computers also supported the cheaper tape drive, but there would be no way that Microsoft Adventure would be possible on cassette. It simply required fast random access. Exclusive to floppy disk also meant that Microsoft Adventure could easily be duplicated with a disk copying program, and Microsoft knew that copied disks of the game could hurt their revenue. So Microsoft and Letwin would come up with perhaps one of the first ever known copy protection methods, which attracted enough media attention at the time, with Byte magazine labeling it a nightmare for the software pirate. The game disk simply would not be able to be copied via conventional methods. And to understand why, let's first take a quick primer on how floppy disks work. A floppy disk contains magnetic media which is capable of storing computer binary data of ones and zeros. Imagine storing some data on the disk, let's say a few hundred bytes, and then trying to access it. Where does it even exist? A typical floppy disk contains concentric rings or tracks that are numbered in sequential order. The number of tracks will vary depending on the size and density of the disk. In this example on the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1, a 5¼ disk will contain 35 tracks, where track 0 represents the outermost track and track 34 would be the innermost. Because disks are double-sided, the same applies for the other side of the disk. Each track is also split into sectors. Using our example again, a standard TRS-80 Model 1 contains 10 sectors per track. It's this organization of tracks and sectors that allows for fast random access of data. Rather than starting from track 0 and reading sequentially, if the operating system knows where to find its data, it can simply seek to that particular track and sector and access it. A standard TRS-80 floppy disk contains 35 tracks and 10 sectors per track, with track 0 containing the bootloader, a small program that will simply auto-boot into the game and set up whatever variables that it needs. But Microsoft Adventure for the TRS-80 does not follow this disk scheme at all. In fact, when trying to make a duplicate of the disk, it appears to be corrupted. So what's actually going on here? Well, as it turns out, when a disk is formatted, each track and sector is numbered from 0 to 34, like we said previously. However, Microsoft Adventure does not follow this numbering scheme at all. Instead, track 1 is actually track 127, and track 2 is track 125, and each track decreases by 2 until the disc hits the 34th track, which in turn ends up being track 61. The only track that is not altered is track 0, because the system still must process its bootloader and load into the game. What's actually occurring here is Microsoft Adventure would renumber the tracks in an attempt to thwart disk copying, and it worked. But how does an original game handle the track misnumbering? The Track 0 bootloader also contains a patch to tell the TRS-80 disk routine how to access the non-standard track numbers, and the game simply boots. This would be a very simple yet effective copy protection measure, especially in 1979. Attempting to make a copy of the game proved very difficult, with many popular copy programs at the time simply failing. The challenge then would be how to circumvent it. It would be difficult, but not impossible. Way before any cracking groups or scene existed, in 1979, Australian-born Nick Andrews was playing Colossus Cave on DEC mainframes at Deakin University. He was a fan of the game and spent many hours playing it on the university mainframes. At home, he had a TRS-80 and got a hold of a copy of Microsoft Adventure one year for Christmas. He tried to make a backup of the game and failed because he loved the game so much and never wanted to lose the original. So he would then spend the next 2 or 3 days learning the copy protection mechanism so he could make a copy of the disc. According to Nick's blog about how he defeated the copy protection, he would confirm the alternative track numbering. His method to copy the disc then was to simply write a disk format program that would apply these track numbers instead of the normal 0, 1, 2, 3 sequence. With the unique formatted disc, he would then write a custom copy tool that used those unique track numbers, effectively generating a one-to-one copy of the game with the protection intact, as it maintained the exact same track numbers. But this would not be the final result. Nick realized it would be easier to simply patch out the bootloader code that maps tracks to the alternative method found on the Microsoft Adventure disk, effectively allowing for the game to run on any standard copy disk and be duplicated with conventional methods. This would be one of the very first known video game cracks that would ever exist, well before the cracking scene came along in the early 80s. He would simply remove the alternative track numbering system and was done. It's 1985, and over in Europe, home computers such as the Amstrad CPC, Sinclair ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro, and the Commodore 64 were selling millions. These computers were cheap and accessible, versatile enough to run many different kinds of programs, but of course, their biggest draw were the games. Everyone from large publishing houses working on the latest movie tie-in games to the bedroom coder were coming up with that next smash hit and that lure to earn millions. Video games in Europe was a massive moneymaker, but as the sales of games increased, so did software piracy. In the early 8-bit home computing days, games usually came on 2 forms of media, cassette and the floppy disk. Both of them weren't difficult to copy. Cassette-based duplication was accessible to anyone who had a decent enough tape duplicator, and floppy disk copying was becoming more sophisticated as well. Software houses were aware that cassette duplication was hard to stop, so early forms of copy protection focused more on features that were baked into the game. In 1983, Matthew Smith's Manic Miner was a smash hit on the ZX Spectrum. The game is still considered one of the pioneering platformers and even ranked number 97 on Polygon's 500 best games of all time list. But because it had no copy protection, it was also one of the most duplicated games at the time. So for the sequel Jet Set Willy, publisher Software Projects wanted to put a stop to the casual copying, so they added a color-coded chart printed in the cassette inlay. When the program loaded, it would display random colors. To allow access to the game, the user would then need to match the colors with the chart and then key in the appropriate code. Simple and effective, yet pointless and tedious for the end user. Each time that they would load the game, they would need to go through the same process. Worse still, for users who were colorblind, vision impaired, or even playing on a monochrome display, it would be at best case difficult and at worst impossible to even play the game. And in the end, the color code chart was easy to duplicate anyway. Publishers were scratching their heads trying to solve the ongoing piracy problem. Anything that involved typing in a word from a manual could easily be photocopied, and tapes could be duplicated, so an extra piece of hardware was needed. The use of dongles or ROM cartridges were not considered a viable option either, as they would add significant expense to the cost. In 1985, a company known as ASAP Developments would come up with a copy protection method that didn't sit between the cassette or disc and the documentation. Rather, it would utilize one part that every user owned but could not be easily tampered with: the television. ASAP Developments would invent what's known as the LensLok, a small piece of plastic with transparent prisms that could be used to deflect light. By taking dots from a television screen and a row of prisms in a sequence, as the light from the television display passes through the prism, the dots can be scrambled to form words or patterns of recognizable characters. If the same prism sequence was used to scramble letters, then it could be used to unscramble them. LensLok was simple and cheap to manufacture, and publishers quickly looked at its viability as an effective anti-piracy tool. The first publisher that would support LensLok would be Firebird Software, with the legendary space trading game Elite. Elite was designed by David Braben and Ian Bell originally for the BBC Micro in 1984. It was ported to many home computers and some game consoles, and it was a landmark release. It would contain an open-ended sandbox of space trading and combat with entire galaxies to explore. It was also one of the first games to utilize effective wireframe 3D, and would go on to spawn 3 sequels: Frontier, Frontier First Encounters, and more recently Elite Dangerous. Elite is considered one of the most important games ever made, and its influence can be seen in modern space trading based games such as EVE Online and No Man's Sky. In an attempt to combat piracy, LensLok would be added to the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 versions of the game. When the game would load, the computer displays a scramble pattern. This is necessary to calibrate the LensLok. So I actually own an original Commodore 64 copy of Elite, which does come with the LensLok protection. So let's go ahead and see how people in 1985 were trying to get their copy of Elite loaded and see how easy it is to actually get through the LensLok protection. Is it a lot of hype and smoke and mirrors and a lot of misleading articles that were posted, or is this genuinely a cumbersome and frustrating copy protection method? Let's go ahead and find out. So what we have here is the game Elite that's loaded on the LensLok screen, and I've got my LensLok right here, and we're going to try to get past this copy protection check. So I'm looking at the instruction sheet, and basically I'm going to read through it just to see how I can get this to work, because I've never gotten a LensLok protection to actually work for me. So it'll say a large H appears on the screen. Using the keys specified on the screen, adjust the H until it's the same width of the lens holder. Put the lens on the screen like so, and then start pressing the arrow keys until the 2 lines match up with the lens itself, with the width of the lens. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is the calibration step that you have to take. And I think that's about right there. So let's call that good. And it says now fold the lens holder into a U shape, ensuring that the words on the holder this side out and the large raised LensLok are on the outside. And it says you will not be able to decode the characters on the screen if the lens is folded the wrong way. You may even break the lens holder. Hold the lens at arm's length against the screen with the feet of the lens firmly against the screen and the top on figure 2. So what we're looking for are the words OK. And you can kind of see the words OK through the lens now. I'm looking at at the screen there. Yeah, I'm looking at it front on, and you can definitely make out the letters okay there. It's a little pixelated and a little kind of all over the place, but it's definitely right. So I think we are calibrated. Let's see if we can figure out what this code is telling us. See, and the difficult part is it's really difficult to make out what this is saying. Is that a 5? Is that saying 5C? So let's try 5C. Well, that didn't work, so let's try another one. And the thing is, there's a timer on this lens as well, so you only get like, I think it's like 30 seconds to make a choice. That looks like an E or a G, and the first one looks like a TG. Let's try TG. No, that doesn't work either, so let's try another one. Let's see, what do we got? Is that a N and a R and D? I see an R and I see a D. RD? That actually worked. So we got past the copy protection, but it took me 3 attempts to actually get past the LensLok. And ultimately, this was one of the biggest issues with LensLok. The idea behind it was pretty decent, but the execution of it was just so tedious, pointless, and frustrating that ultimately it was just easier to basically get a cracked copy of the game and then play that. So with my test, I was lucky to get through the LensLok protection, but if I wasn't, I would have had 3 attempts to enter in the correct code, and then what would happen is the computer would reset itself. I would have to reload the game again and then try and defeat the protection. Now, on the Commodore 64, as you've seen, it doesn't really seem like a big deal when you load from disk, but keep in mind on a system such as the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, where a copy of Elite came on cassette, it was a 10-minute load, then followed by the LensLok protection check. And if you failed that, then you would have to reload the game, wait 10 more minutes, and then try again. So it's obvious how anti-consumer the LensLok protection ended up being. And in the end, it was just easier to acquire a pirated or a cracked copy of the game. Let's go ahead and take a look at the ZX Spectrum version of Elite through an emulator, and I'll show you how easy and trivial the LensLok protection is to crack. So the question is, well, how do we crack this protection? Because it is one of the most frustrating and just annoying versions of copy protection that ever graced video games. So this is very, very simple to do, and I'm going to show you one method of doing this. There are definitely ways that crackers probably did this in other ways, and I am not an expert cracker by any means. I do know Z or Z80 assembly language, and I know enough to be dangerous, let's put it that way. So when we're at this screen here, we're waiting for the code to be input in. What we want to do is load up our debugger on our ZX Spectrum emulator. I'm using ZX or ZX Spin. There are different emulators that you can use, but we'll use ZX Spin because it does have a pretty good debugger, and I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. And as you can see, we're at this particular instruction, which is a halt instruction. So underneath that instruction is basically all the logic that is accepting the user input and then doing the comparison to ensure that the LensLok check is successful. We're not even going to worry about this stuff. What I'm going to do is look at the stack. This is the call stack, and as you can see on top of the stack here is the address C2AC. So if we jump to that particular address in memory, you can see that it's doing this particular jump into this particular memory location. So somewhere in our jump statement in C2A8 is that halt statement that we were just at. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint on this particular address location. So the next time that we type in a code, say 63, as you can see, it's hit our breakpoint here. So what is actually going on this particular line? Well, you can see here it's doing a instruction called JRC and then this location. So if we pull up our Z80 instruction manual or Z80 instruction manual, JRCNN basically means jump if C is set. So what that is basically telling us is if we go back and take a look, it's saying jump to this memory location if C which is this flag here. The condition flag C is set. As you can see, it's set. It's been checked. Therefore, it's going to jump into this routine. But what if we unchecked C and ran execution? What would happen then? As you can see, we have basically bypassed the protection. And that is a very, very simple way of doing so. There were 11 games in total that used LensLok, with Elite being the first and the most popular. Now, I want to mention that there were different lenses for different games. And there was also stories and reports that sometimes you were given the wrong lens for the wrong game, which means no matter how hard you tried to get through the copy protection, because you had the wrong lens, there was no way you were ever going to get past it. While LensLok initially seemed like a great and cheap idea to stop the casual copying of games, in the end its usage was short-lived. I have two separate copies of Elite for the Commodore 64. One of them uses LensLok, but the other copy, which is a later print, simply contains a fast loader and disk copy protection. Another title on the list is Silicon Dreams by Firebird. Once again, my copy has no trace of LensLok protection at all, simply favouring the more common manual protection. In the mid-80s, computer games were simple. You would load games from cassette or floppy disk onto your Commodore 64, Apple II or PC and have fun. The games themselves weren't large either, usually available on a few floppy disks. This meant that making copies of those games was easy enough. Blank floppy disks could be purchased from most retail stores pretty cheap, and every computer at the time usually had a way to make copies of games. But in most cases, the games needed to be cracked first. Original games on floppy disk were sometimes mastered with non-standard sectors, or perhaps there would be a manual copy protection check that required you to own an original copy of the game with its user manual, so you could enter the code that the game was asking of you. In North America, the IBM PC was fast becoming the dominant home computer, and by the late 80s, hard drives were becoming a standard. While games that you would purchase from the store would still be shipped on floppy disks, owning a hard drive meant that you could completely install the game and play it without the need of the floppy disks. But this approach to installing games onto a hard disk would raise concerns about software piracy. In order to mitigate this, software publishers would usually resort to adding manual protection in their games. My first recollection of manual-based copy protection would be the gold-boxed Advanced Dungeons & Dragons games. Champions of Krynn on the Amiga was one such game. When the game would load, manual protection simply works by prompting you to locate the word from the manual. With a quick lookup of the manual, you would find the word, enter it, and then be able to play the game. You would not be asked to enter a new code again for that play session, but if you restarted the game, you would be prompted to enter a new code. Manual-based protection stopped casual copying of disks, and it was well and truly before most of us had scanners. But nothing would stop you from taking your manual to the local library and photocopying all the pages, giving that out to your friends, and effectively defeating the protection. It's easier to see why the manual-based copy protection wasn't really cutting it though. Publishers then tried to add manuals or codes in dark colored paper or dark text in an attempt to mitigate photocopying, but this could still be circumvented. Over on the Commodore Amiga, hard drives were too becoming a standard and allowed for more games to be installed, especially as the number of disks required to play some games increased significantly, and it faced the same problems as the IBM PC. Software publishers tried to come up with new and sophisticated methods to defeat software piracy. The manual-based copy protection wasn't really cutting it anymore, but software publishers would soon introduce a new variation of the manual-based copy protection, and that would be known as the code wheel. The code wheel has origins dating back to 1470, when Italian architect Leon Battista Alberti would create a decoder wheel which he would use to encode messages. And in more recent times, Alan Turing, a British cryptologist, helped crack the Enigma code leading to the end of World War II. A code wheel is a simple device that contains two circles. It could then be used to encode or decode messages. Usually, the outer ring would contain the plain alphabet, and the inner ring would contain a scrambled alphabet known as the cipher. The cipher alphabet is usually the plain alphabet rotated left or right by some number of positions. And with a simple translation, it was possible to encode messages. But code wheels in video games work a little differently. They don't actually contain a cipher in the sense that they're used to decode hidden messages. Think of them more as a translation wheel. A game will prompt you with a code, and then you use the code wheel to line up the rings that correspond to that code, and then enter the value that's in the middle or cutout portion. My first experience with a code wheel was on the Amiga with the game FA-18 Interceptor from Electronic Arts. Released in 1988, it's an iconic jet fighter simulator that allows you to embark on 10 missions. The game ran fast on a stock Amiga 500, and it's an amazing piece of programming. The original North American version of the game came on a single disc, and it had a code wheel hidden in its gatefold sleeve. The game would prompt you to enter a value from a 4-character code. If the code was, for example, 2213, you would line up the outer ring with the number 2, the middle ring with the number 2, and the inner ring with the number 1. And then by looking at the contents of what's inside number 3, that would be the code that you would enter. In this example, the answer would be 136625. The problem with this code wheel, however, is that it's not really any more advanced than the manual-based copy protection. While it is cool to get a code wheel inside the game packaging, ultimately this code wheel can be taken apart and photocopied individually and then reconstructed. And if you weren't up to the task of taking apart your code wheel, you could simply build an Excel spreadsheet of all the possible combinations. Sure, this may take you a while, but it was certainly an option. Just like manual-based copy protection, game publishers became a little more creative. The game Falcon by Spectrum Holobyte that released for the Commodore Amiga, IBM PC, and Atari ST also would contain a code wheel. This only had 2 rings, however, but as you can see, it contained symbols instead of letters, and those symbols would be light blue on a white background, making it more difficult for both photocopying or replicating on an Excel spreadsheet. The advanced Dungeons & Dragons Goldbox games would also begin migrating towards code wheels. This would utilize a 2-ring code wheel that would have symbols instead of letters and numbers, but unfortunately they would be quite easy to photocopy. And curiously enough, my copy of Hillsfar for the Commodore 64, for whatever reason, would come included with not 1, but 3 individual code wheels. This meant that you could make 2 copies of the game and hand it out to your friends with a copy of the code wheel each. It also meant an easier decision to take apart a code wheel and photocopy one. There was also a long-standing rumour that the game Pool of Radiance would use the exact same code wheel as Hillsfar, so I decided to try it out myself. I downloaded an uncracked copy of Pool of Radiance and installed it on my Commodore Amiga, and surely enough, with my trusty Hillsfar code wheel, I was able to get past the copy protection check. Software publishers were well aware that code wheels weren't foolproof, and to mitigate the ongoing piracy, they decided to get more creative, and they would do this by replacing letters and numbers with symbols. The game Another World, released in 1991 as Out of This World in the United States, is a cinematic platformer that was developed by Eric Chahi. Rather than asking the user to enter in a keyword or phrase, it incorporated symbols. The symbols themselves were not fixed width, and the inner window selection was not standard, which meant that trying to photocopy this code wheel and then trying to use an X-Acto knife to cut out the exact pieces of the symbols would be a lot more difficult, but certainly not impossible. This was also compounded by the fact that the symbols were not fixed width. But even with these advancements, code wheels were a pain, and copy protection checks were always annoying. So when LucasArts released The Secret of Monkey Island, their code wheel was called Dial a Pirate. This would have you match up the face with what was displayed on the screen, and then enter in the date. For The Secret of Monkey Island 2, they would use a similar code wheel, but this one was called Mix and Mojo, which would ask the user to complete the voodoo recipe by entering the proportions of the ingredients. With symbol-based code wheels slowly becoming more standard, it meant that the original owners would be less inclined to take theirs apart for photocopying. But for the cracking groups, code wheel-based protection would be trivial to break. Now, of course, nothing beats the simplicity of just completely bypassing the protection or cracking the copy protection itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at Pools of Radiance on the Amiga we're going to fire up an emulator and an action replay cartridge and attempt to crack code wheel protection ourselves. Now, the most effective way to defeat a code wheel protection other than photocopying the code wheel itself is to just crack the protection. And we're going to go ahead and crack the code wheel protection of Pool of Radiance for the Commodore Amiga. Now, just to kind of show you what's going on here, this is the Pool of Radiance copy protection, and we did see earlier that a Hillsfar code wheel would actually work on this game, but let's assume that you didn't have access to the code wheel back in the day and you were sitting at this screen, and you would normally have 3 attempts to type in a code. So let's just try 3 attempts here, and you know, we're gonna basically make the copy protection fail, and after the 3rd attempt it will kick you out back to the, you know, just the DOS prompt, right? So let's go ahead and figure out how can we crack this protection. Now let's go ahead and enter a word in MVG123, but we're not going to press enter here. We're going to break into our action replay, and on WinUAE all I need to do is press page up, and you can see we're in our action replay. So from here what we can do now is we can search for that string that we just typed in. So let's search for MVG123, and it's going to basically just search the memory for that particular string, and it should hopefully find a match. And now what we want to do is find all the occurrences in the code where it's actually being referenced. So we use the FA command to do that. So as you can see, it's still going through memory right now, but it's already brought back 2 results, 56C10 and 56C52. Now what we want to do is put a breakpoint on 56C52, and we've got a breakpoint there. Now just to show you, to illustrate what's going on here, so we've got, if we type in M, 5A 5C5, that's basically showing us what's in memory. And as you can see, we've got MVG123 in our memory blocks. So essentially what we're doing at 56C52 is we're just basically pointing to that address in memory, loading that effective address location into our address register. So what do we do now? Well, what we can do now is we've set a breakpoint at that particular line. So if we go back now and press enter at this point, it should actually hit our breakpoint with any luck. And as you can see, it's hit our breakpoint at 56C52. So what can we do here? Well, a couple of things that we can take a look at, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through the code one line at a time. So there is a TR command or a trace command, and you can see here it's moving A0, the address of A0 into D0. So if we continue moving, stepping through this code, eventually we should come across something that is bringing in the actual correct code itself from the list of valid words that the code wheel is expecting. And let's continue to step through this. Now that particular line there looks a little interesting to me because it's loading the effective address of another address into A0. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what's in 5AC4C. And you can see it's got the text beware. Now, is that the actual code? I'm not sure. If we continue to step through memory, you can see that there are all these strings in there, and these are most likely the kind of the meta, you know, the entire list of code wheel responses that has been loaded into the game. If we go back and take a look at the code wheel, you can see how the words in the memory location match up with the code wheel. So we are most definitely on the right path here. So it may not necessarily be beware, that could just be the first one in the list. So there may be an offset to another code. We're not really too sure what that might be. So let's continue to step through this code. And you can see here it's adding D1 to A0, so it's like it's basically pointing to a different offset, but I don't know if that's necessarily that interesting to us, because ultimately what we want to look for here is something that's doing a comparison or a test, for example. And this particular line here looks interesting to me, this BNE 5A3A6. Now, this is basically, if we basically look at the disassembly here, let's basically get a larger look at what's going on here. So let's do a disassembly of 5A3, we'll say 50, and let's just kind of step through this until we get to 7E. So that's the line that we're in right there. Now, as you can see on 5A366, we're loading in that list of codes that the code wheel has in its memory, and then it's adding the contents of D1 to A0. So that's like it's pointing to the actual code that is the correct one. And there's a couple of other commands, and then it's doing a test of D0, and then it's doing a break if not equal to 5A3A6. So just for giggles, what if we change the line 5A37E and we basically say NOP? In other words, it's no instruction, we just NOP it out. What will that do for us? Well, before we proceed, let's go ahead and take a look at our disassembly again, just to make sure that that command actually was applied. As you can see, our command is now a NOP at 5A37E. So let's see what happens when we jump back out. And as you can see, it looks like we have gotten past the protection. And as you can see, we've cracked pulsar radiance. By simply replacing the string comparison branch, if not equal instruction to always continue, we are able to proceed past the check and onto the game. Very simple. I should add that because it's text-based, cracking this game was quite trivial. It took me maybe about an hour, and to the experienced cracker, they could probably handle it in a matter of minutes. Since the beginning, Nintendo has always taken measures to ensure the quality of their products and to mitigate bootlegging and unauthorized tampering of their games and hardware. In North America and Europe, the Nintendo seal of quality was stamped on all official licensed Nintendo products. While it's easy to disregard it as some quick marketing gimmick, the seal was important. In 1985, after the video game crash, Nintendo was looking to bring the Famicom to North America as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. At the time, no retailer would even think about trying to sell video games, so to win back their confidence, Nintendo did two things. First, the NES was designed to look like a VCR, and more importantly, Nintendo ensured that every single NES game went through an approval process by Nintendo Japan President Hiroshi Yamauchi. This would ultimately stop, for the most part, the flood of low-quality and unlicensed games that killed the video game market before the crash. The seal of quality worked, and the NES rejuvenated the industry in North America, selling over 34 million units and over 60 million worldwide. But in order to pull this off, Nintendo introduced anti-tampering hardware in both the console and its cartridges. Nintendo was not happy after the video game crash in North America, and they wanted to come up with ways to break back into the market, but they knew it was going to be difficult. So they decided to come up with an ingenious approach to locking out unauthorized tampering and unlicensed games from the up-and-coming Nintendo Entertainment System. In 1985, Nintendo engineer Katsuya Nakagawa filed a patent titled "A System for Determining Authenticity of an External Memory Used in an Information Processing Apparatus." This patent goes into detail outlining the concept of a game cartridge containing a key device and a console containing a lock device as an anti-piracy or anti-tampering system. The key and lock devices were controller chips that formed what was known as the 10NES. The 10NES was also known as the Checking Integrated Circuit, or CIC. It was specifically designed for front-loading North American and European NES consoles. The way that it works is relatively simple. On the main NES motherboard is a chip known as the lock. This is a 4-bit sharp CPU, and each game cartridge contained the exact same 4-bit chip. This was known as the key chip. Both chips contained the exact same code. The design was based around a simple lock and key paradigm. You use the key or the cartridge to unlock the console and play the game, which is located on the motherboard. When the cartridge was inserted to the NES, both the key and the lock chips would communicate with each other with custom code, and if the check was successful, the CIC chip would allow the game to run. If the test failed, the system would reset itself, and on repeat failures it would reset over and over, essentially locking the game out. Digging a little deeper, these 4-bit chips are directly wired to each other and run the exact same code at the exact same time, exactly in step with each other. Both chips calculate what data needs to be transferred to the other, and if what was received is not what was expected, the lock chip then resets the console. To further obfuscate what the code was doing, there is a total of 16 different unique streams of data that can be generated. This is done by use of the seed pin, which acts as a random generator and decides which one of the 16 streams it needs to use. It then lets the key chip know of its decision. There's also the reset speed pins, which keep track of how quickly the reset needs to be set to. While the lock and key paradigm is one that's very common when it comes to security and anti-tampering, the code itself was another story. Although it's possible to extract dumps of the CIC ROMs themselves, no one actually knew how the CPU worked. I mentioned earlier that Nintendo did the best it could to stop the flow of unlicensed games on the NES, but they weren't successful in doing this completely. There were still some unlicensed games that appeared on the NES, and these companies that were developing these games resorted to brute force methods in order to circumvent the CIC circuitry. The first examples of this was to simply spike the voltage, in other words, send a kind of voltage spike over the wire in order just to knock out the chip itself. And then from this, then they decided to utilize a donor cartridge approach where you would plug in the unlicensed version of the game using a licensed cartridge as the donor chip in order to play the unlicensed game itself. Atari, still reeling from the video game crash, were unhappy with Nintendo's heavy-handed licensing model and released unlicensed games on its Tengen brand by coming up with a method to bypass the CIC check and Nintendo's security. In order to do this, they would need to reverse engineer the chip. But this proved to be difficult. After many different attempts at building data capture hardware between the lock and key chips, and even attempts to decap the chip to understand the internals, bypassing the CIC would prove to be extremely difficult. But after a few months, Atari unveiled their own equivalent of the CIC known as the Rabbit, which was used in some of their games, with the most popular being Tetris. The now famous story is that Atari got access to the 10NES code by filing a case in court requesting it. This resulted in Nintendo suing Atari in court and winning. Atari claimed fair use as their defense and lost. But the CIC chip stood firm. Nintendo used the chip in the Super NES and Nintendo 64 consoles with some enhancements, but it still used the same sharp 4-bit CPU. And even by 2006, the chip was still not cracked and no one knew how the code worked. Now, to be clear, the CIC chip itself was very difficult to reverse engineer, but it was quite trivial to bypass. What I mean by that is, by opening up the NES system and getting to the motherboard, it was simply easy enough to disable the reset line on the CIC chip and completely disable the chip itself. This meant that many games would then just simply work and not have to worry about going through the CIC check itself. But Nintendo quickly got a hold of this and started to implement protection into their games to look for a disabled CIC and stop the game dead in its tracks. In 2006, the Nintendo homebrew community decided that it would make efforts to uncover the secrets of the CIC chip. By this time, the original patents for the chip had expired, and because of more readily available hardware for hobbyists that was affordable, they quickly went to work. The problem was, the CIC chip eluded just about everyone who attempted to learn its internals, and indeed how it actually worked, and once again hit the same roadblocks as before. So work shifted over to Tengen's Rabbit chip, which was almost an exact replica of the 10NES chip anyway. But the problem was, because Atari utilized Nintendo's copyrighted code, the Rabbit chip worked exactly like the 10NES. When the Rabbit chip was decapped, which is a process of removing the ceramic package from the chip itself by utilizing acid, but in such a way as to not destroy the chip itself, it was discovered that there were some additional circuits on the Rabbit chip that were not found on the 10NES chip. And once voltages were applied to one of the unused pins on the rabbit, it began to dump out the contents and the state of the chip for all 16 streams of data. Once the bit stream was dumped and analysed, it was trivial to figure out the CPU instructions of the rabbit chip, and the entire code for the CIC algorithm was completely reconstructed. The discovery was fascinating. The CPU had a 4-bit microprocessor that had 2 registers, accumulator A and a second register X. The processor contained its own instruction set. There is only addition and subtraction functions and no branching instructions at all. There's also an exchange instruction that takes the value in register A and swaps it around with what's in register X. There's also one instruction that was never quite figured out what it did. It was known as the special mystery instruction. If it wasn't for Tengen leaving this feature on the chip, this discovery may have never occurred, or at least would have taken much more time. On the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64, CIC security chips were also used. These were similar sharp 4-bit CPU chips, but with different internal code. However, because the instruction set was known from the Tengen chip, the CIC-ROM was simply dumped out, and with some trial and error, the chip was cracked pretty easily. The Super CIC is a homebrew replacement chip that can be applied to any cartridge to provide things like region swapping on demand. On the other hand, the Nintendo 64 CIC was different from the NES and Super NES, and for many years on things like EverDrive or conversion cartridges would require a donor CIC from an original game to work. But in 2015, utilizing decapping techniques, the instruction set and code was once again defeated. It was known as the Ultra CIC, and has become the preferred method over sacrificing original Nintendo 64 cartridges. From the original invention in the early 80s, Nintendo's lockout chip stood firm for over 20 years and 3 generations of console. And while the NES, Super NES were relatively similar, Nintendo 64 CIC remained a target. But with all 3 systems ultimately offering open source replacements, the CIC chip stood the test of time and was one of the most important chips in early cartridge-based Nintendo hardware. In 1985, Ocean Software saw potential for licensed games based on television shows or movies. While they weren't the first, generally speaking, they were the first that did it right. Ocean had a reputation for movie tie-in games that were a quality above the competition, and the pick of these early games was Robocop. The license was secured for $20,000 and Robocop released in 1988. The game itself wasn't brilliant. The Amiga version was an average port of the Data East arcade game. It suffered from poor scrolling, and the graphics were average with an annoying border around the gameplay window. Robocop released on the Amiga in Christmas of 1988, and it was a massive seller. Ocean then quickly prompted sequels Robocop 2 in 1990 and Robocop 3 in 1991. Other versions of Robocop 3 arrived on other platforms as side-scrolling shooters in 1992, but the Amiga, Atari ST and MS-DOS versions of the game were developed by Digital Image Design, who were best known for the development of high-quality flight simulators on the Amiga, such as F-29 Retaliator, and later TFX and EF-2000 on the PC. Robocop 3 on the Amiga was set in a fully 3D world with many arcade sections including driving, first-person shooting action, flying a gyrocopter, and even a fighting game level. These sections are connected with great and interesting cutscenes that keep the story moving along nicely. In 2020, this game has aged terribly, but in 1991, this was one of the earliest 3D games that was based on a movie that told a story, and was quite impressive technically. Robocop 3 represented a massive departure from the first 2 games, which were essentially just side-scrolling arcade-style games. Robocop 3 was an early 3D-style game that you could say took a lot of inspiration from games like Operation Wolf, but it also had early, first-person shooter elements as well that cannot be ignored. Piracy was a major problem for the Amiga, Atari ST and MS-DOS computers at the time, and publishers were forced to come up with different ways to try to mitigate the spread of illegal game discs. The Amiga was perhaps the most notorious, with games literally cracked within hours of release, uploaded to bulletin boards worldwide, and in some cases, games were cracked and released even before they hit retail shops. Many publishers tried to beat the pirates and came up with different, more sophisticated ways of copy protecting their games. And another thing that was interesting with Robocop 3 on the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST was it came with a small dongle which was utilized for its copy protection. Around 1991, many Amiga magazines were talking about a rumor of a special device that was circulated with the game Robocop 3. Rumors of a special chip that will somehow be attached to a normal disc are being circulated, but Ocean are being extremely tight-lipped about it. According to our source, the chip has over 50 separate levels of protection that after 2 solid weeks hacking by an Ocean programmer would only yield 1 level of clearance. When Robocop 3 was released, people had noticed that it came with game discs, a manual, and a small device. This device was the idea of Ocean Software's development director at the time, Gary Bracey. These dongles would require you to plug the device in to be able to play the game, and Robocop 3 was the first ever video game that implemented such a form of copy protection. The dongle would simply plug into the Amiga's joystick port, communicate with the game to authenticate that it was present, and off it went. Without it, the game would simply not load. Ocean Software even boasted in magazines that the copy protection was so sophisticated that it would take a good programmer months and months to crack. It only took cracking group Fairlight just 5.5 hours. So what actually went wrong? How does the copy protection work? What does the dongle actually do? And how did Fairlight end up cracking the game? Dongle copy protections seemingly are very sophisticated, but as we'll see, the one that was used in Robocop 3 on the Amiga actually was quite simple. We said that the dongle plugged into the Amiga's joystick port. If we look at the memory address map, the joystick port is located at address hexadecimal DFF00C, otherwise known as Joy1 DAT. The dongle would pulse a combination of the fire button and a joystick direction. Notice that the fire button is located at a different address at BFE001. When the dongle generated the pulse, it would flip bit 8 on Joy1 DAT from 0 to 1, and on each pulse would flip the bits back and forth. If there was no dongle connected, Joy1 DAT state would remain the same, so the check would fail and it was assumed that you were running a pirate copy of the game. To crack the game, all that was needed was to find the dongle check in the game code and make it return success each time. But it wasn't that simple. You couldn't just connect a joystick to the port and spam the fire button to emulate the dongle's presence. First of all, the game had 21 dongle checks littered throughout the game, and second, the dongle had a connection between 2 pins that normally wouldn't be present on a joystick. Furthermore, Ocean knew that crackers would be interested in reading bits from the joystick port, so they obfuscated the checks. They did this in 2 ways, by using a TVD or trace vector decoder, and by utilizing self-modifying code. The Motorola 68000 at the processor level has what's known as the trace vector decoder or TVD. TVDs was one of the most popular ways to implement copy protection on the Amiga and Atari ST. When a TVD is implemented in code, as it's stepping through, it will decrypt the next instruction in an encrypted code block, execute that instruction, and then re-encrypt it. As it's stepping through encrypted code, eventually we'll hit a predetermined piece of code which then does the final decryption pass on the code block itself. And until this task is completed, you can't physically see any usable code because everything is encrypted, which means that you can't crack or alter code because you can't see it. Robocop 3's code was completely encrypted this way, except for one area, the disk loader. This provided Fairlight with a way to crack the encryption and get a look at the dongle check code and crack the game. The dongle checks themselves were also obfuscated, which also included self-modifying code to throw crackers off. So it wasn't as simple as searching for Joy1 DAT or hexadecimal address DFF00C, but it really wasn't that hard. If we consider this block of code, it's 68,000 assembly, but we'll explain it in simple terms. The address hexadecimal 14E62 is loaded into register A0, this is an address register, and then the hexadecimal value 1F3A6 is moved into register D0. This is a data register. What happens next is the two instructions are now subtracting what's in register D0 from the address register A0 with 30 appended to it, and for the second subtraction with 40 appended to it. In other words, subtract 1F3A6 from 14E92, and for the second, subtract 1F3A6 from 14EA2. This is where the self-modifying code comes into play. If we take a closer look and see what's in address 14E92, it happens to be E1, E3, B2. So if we logically subtract 1F3A6 from E1, E3, B2, we get the result DFF00C, which happens to be Joy1 DAT, which is the port where the dongle is connected. And the second subtraction gives us hexadecimal BFE001, which is the memory address for the Amiga's CIA chip, which handles 5-button presses. With this discovery, the crack was to essentially bypass the fail check and return success, but care had to be taken to ensure that the state of registers and memory was obviously not tampered with. Fairlight had acquired the game at 9:30 AM UK time, and by 5 o'clock the same day, it was cracked 100%. Robocop 3 has 21 unique copy protection checks like this, but not all of them were coded in the same way, but they all did similar things to the code we just saw. Fairlight cracker Gaston wrote the original crack, while Galahad, who is a well-known Amiga cracker, patched the protection in the later Platinum version, which did not use a dongle at all, but instead used TVD as well as manual copy protection. Ocean's attempt at dongle-based copy protection had well and truly failed. After the crack had circulated, Gary Bracey said not everyone who had an Amiga had programming skills, and we were attempting to deter casual copying at this level. Our hope was to delay the proliferation of copy disks for a short amount of time in order to maximize sales. The measure certainly prevented the casual copier from just duplicating disk to disk, but I agree, it didn't take long for the professional pirates to copy and distribute the game. While it's true the dongle itself had failed, it was largely irrelevant thanks to the reputation in the media leading up to the release of Robocop 3, which generated a lot of sales. After all, you wouldn't be playing this game unless you had an original copy of it with the dongle included, because there would not be a cracked version anytime soon, at least according to Ocean PR themselves. Incidentally, the Platinum Edition version of the game that was released later had a separate copy protection method and no dongle. We won't ever know if Ocean had ever planned to continue using the dongle after Robocop 3's copy protection was so easily dispatched, but aside from some embarrassment, it didn't really harm their brand. In 1987, the battle between the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga for supremacy in the household was at its peak, with each company trading blows with each other in a duel to the death. This was truly a classic era in video games, with many original franchises and arcade ports being developed for both systems. Innovation was off the charts, and it was an awesome time to be a gamer. Both the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga at its core used the Motorola 68000 CPU, and both utilized 3.5-inch floppy disk drives. Games would come on one or more floppy disks, and there would be the inevitable disk swapping in order to play through the game, with some games even coming on as much as 12 floppy disks to play. Software piracy was also rampant on both machines. If you were a part of this era, you probably owned at least a few copied games or discs. There was a massive amount of copying that was going on. Everything from schoolyard swapping of discs to fully fledged bootlegging with replica boxes and disc labels. Piracy was a huge problem for software publishers back then, and of course came up with different ways to attempt to mitigate it as best as they could. The earliest forms of copy protection on the Atari ST and Amiga was simple. It was based on the manual protection. In other words, the manual that came with the game, with a simple lookup of a word on a page. There was nothing stopping you from duplicating the game, and if you had access to a photocopier, you could easily replicate the manual. This was pretty simple to defeat. It was also trivial for hackers to patch these checks out of the game. By simply locating the code that jumps to the subroutine that handles the manual check, it can be easily patched out, or the manual check itself always returns true, so you could enter any word and proceed. There was also the code wheel protection. This was popular on the Gold Box Advanced Dungeons & Dragons games, as well as LucasArts adventure titles like The Secret of Monkey Island. The code wheel was a different take on the manual protection method, but the code wheel had many combinations of results and made duplication tricky. But of course, if you were willing, you could just take apart the code wheel and photocopy each piece of it. The protection was also very easily patched by hackers, usually in a matter of hours after the game had come out. Software publishers knew that in order to mitigate copying of their games, they'd need to get more creative, and soon, disk-based protection mechanisms were commonplace. In general, disk copy protection is to apply some form of non-standard method to the master disk which will stop a disk copier from either reading the disk or making a backup of it. Most Amiga and Atari ST games from this era have this protection method installed. For example, if I attempt to read this disk in my Amiga, it won't even read it, and if I try to make a backup of it, it fails with errors. This type of behavior with original disks is normal. There were many different variants of disk copy protection, with one of the most popular known as CopyLock. Developed by Rob Northern, it was used in both the Amiga and ST, with hundreds of games containing this protection, with the first CopyLock game being released in 1987. Before we talk about this method, let's do a quick primer on a typical floppy disk that would be used in a Commodore Amiga or Atari ST. A 3.5-inch floppy disk is a circular piece of magnetic media that is double-sided. A double-sided floppy disk contains up to 880 kilobytes worth of data. A track is a circular path around the disk, and on both the Atari ST and the Amiga, there are 40 tracks per side. Each track is then divided into smaller blocks known as sectors, which are 512 bytes in size. The Amiga comes with 11 sectors per track as standard, and the Atari ST uses 9 sectors per track. A CopyLock protected floppy disk contains one long track that's not broken into sectors at all. This track is known as the CopyLock serial or verification track. Both the Amiga and ST have quite sophisticated disk controllers. The Amiga actually uses its custom chips and DMA to handle disk I/O. The CopyLock serial track can be easily read on an Amiga or ST floppy disk drive, but it cannot be written easily without very expensive floppy drive mastering equipment. Each game protected by CopyLock has code that can read and decode the CopyLock serial track. The encrypted code then verifies that the disk has the correct serial key, which is uniquely generated for each game. If this check is passed, then the game loads successfully. CopyLock stopped the casual copying of games, but cracking groups had skilled coders and crackers that knew 68,000 assembly and the intricate details of both the Amiga and Atari ST floppy drive controllers and were able to easily defeat this protection. In fact, most CopyLock games were cracked in a matter of hours and released on bulletin boards to be spread worldwide, in some instances even before the game was on store shelves in some parts of the world. So the best forms of copy protection, at least from the developer's standpoint, are the ones where it doesn't seem like anything has gone wrong. In other words, everything seems to be normal, but then all of a sudden, maybe a few hours into the game, some weird quirks and issues start to crop up, and you're not really sure if it's part of the game, or maybe the code isn't the best and it needs a patch. You're not really sure if it's something that was caused by the crack of the game itself, or if it was part of the game. Now, this particular thing was made famous by Spyro the Dragon on the original PlayStation. When you played a backup copy of Spyro the Dragon, you would start to get some weird behavior and some weirdness in the game. And it would basically tell you that you were playing a pirated copy of the game. But it still would let you play through the game, or so it seemed. But it continued to a point where the game itself just got so annoying and so unplayable that it was obvious that the game would not continue, or you couldn't finish the game. And the other big one that I'm thinking about is on the PC, known as the fade copy protection. This was very similar in that it would start out quite normal, but over time, as you continue to play through the game that had fade copy protection, it would render the game eventually unplayable. In 1987, a company known as Faster Than Light released a game that would be later known as one of the most influential and important games ever made. Known as Dungeon Master, it was a 4-player real-time dungeon crawler and was a smash hit on the Atari ST and Amiga. And it went on to become the best-selling Atari ST game ever. It's also seen ports to the Sharp X68000, FM Towns, MS-DOS PCs, Apple IIgs, and even on the Super Nintendo. Dungeon Master was released by FTL in 1987 and was one of the best games for the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga. I remember back in the day when I owned an Amiga, I only had 512 kilobytes of RAM, and this game needed a 1 meg RAM expansion to play. And I remember I was so jealous and so unhappy that I didn't have enough RAM to play the game. But eventually I got a RAM upgrade and was able to play the game in its entirety and complete it. And it's one of the best, most atmospheric games I've ever played. It's a awesome dungeon crawler, one of the original dungeon crawlers which spawned an entire genre of games like Eye of the Beholder, Dungeon Hack, Ultima Underworld, and much more. Stone Keep comes to mind as well by Interplay. And this was the original game. It had no music whatsoever in the game, but it had some of the best atmospheric sound effects I'd ever heard. But there was another part of Dungeon Master that was as devious as the game itself, and that was the copy protection. If we consider traditional copy protection, there's two approaches usually to defeat it, either by cracking the game and rendering the protection useless, or by somehow making a copy of the game with the protection intact so that the computer believes that you are playing an original disc. So let's talk about the Atari ST version of Dungeon Master, since it's the one that I have here and it's an original version of the game. But keep in mind, the Amiga uses the exact same copy protection. If you insert an original Dungeon Master disc into the drive, you can open it up, browse the files, make a copy of the disc, and everything just works. You can even launch and play the game. So, great job, we've copied the game and defeated the protection. But what protection even? It was a simple copy of the files from the disc, and at this point you probably think that I'm joking. But like I said, Dungeon Master has some of the most devious copy protection ever invented. So what exactly is going on? Remember how I said that the Atari ST floppy disk was formatted with 9 sectors per track? The Dungeon Master disk was formatted with 10 sectors per track. This would provide additional space on the disk, and the ST was perfectly capable of reading a disk that's formatted with 10 sectors. So this really wasn't a factor on the protection itself, rather than allowing the game to fit entirely on a single floppy disk. On the first track, if we look at Sector 8, it's not actually labelled Sector 8, it's labelled Sector 247. The ST will read this sector as 247, but if you attempt to make a disk copy of the game, it's not capable of writing Sector 247. This is the copy protection of the game. The contents of this sector, labelled 247, are read if the disk is original, but any copies that are made would be rendered useless. This in itself isn't difficult to circumvent, and that's what hackers did. Dungeon Master quickly was cracked and released on bulletin boards like normal, but it was apparent that there was more at play here. Many people complained after a few minutes to a few hours of gameplay that they would experience weird behaviour in the game. For example, using a throwing weapon would just be suspended in the air, or opening a door would do nothing. Others complained that it kept asking for the game disc to be reinserted into the drive, while some others were getting System Error 60 displayed on their screen. All these issues were a result of the copy protection of the game, which was far from being defeated. If we think about storage media like floppy disks, DVDs and tape drives, all digital data is stored as binary or as ones and zeros. On a DVD, a pit or an area where the laser has burned is the equivalent of a 1, and a land is a 0. On a floppy disk, a 1 is if the write head has magnetized that area on the disk, or a 0 if it's demagnetized. These 1s and 0s form the contents of the storage media, and in this case the Dungeon Master game disk on floppy disk. But what if there was a way to somehow write a bit on a disk that sometimes might read as a 1, or sometimes might read as a 0, in some indeterminate state? This is known as a fuzzy bit, and it lived on Sector 7 of Track 0 on the disk. Its value is never known, it's either a 1 or a 0 and can change with each read of the disk. The game would know that a backup or pirate copy was being played if the result from the fuzzy bit was always the same, but if the result switched around between a 1 or a 0, then the game would play just fine. This fuzzy bit protection was so clever, it kept hackers stumped for months. They weren't really sure what was going on, but eventually they cracked the protection by simply patching this copy protection check out of the game, or so they thought. The best way to beat a cracker at their own game is to convince them that they've won. FTL made sure that if a protection check failed, then nothing would happen. In other words, it would still allow the user to play through the game as normal, but after some amount of time, the game would start to freeze or display the symptoms mentioned before, like the frozen doors or the system error 60. The crackers weren't even sure that their methods were working. On top of this, the protection check was littered throughout the game over and over again, and you'd need to play through the entire game to be sure that every single check was identified and caught. In the end, there were as many as 6 different checks, with some of them living in data files, not even in the main executable code. So when the graphics data file would load from disk into memory, it might trigger a protection check there. No one really knew where all of them were, except for the developers. In the end, Dungeon Master didn't beat the pirates, but it kept them clueless for an entire year. The protection eventually was completely patched, but FTL had won the battle. All while Dungeon Master became a smash hit on the Atari ST and Amiga and sold many copies. The fuzzy bit protection worked and was some of the most well-crafted early forms of DRM in video game history. It's also worth noting that the Super NES version of the game was released by JVC in 1991. It was a good port of the game that retains the same mood and atmosphere of the original, and it also uses a DSP2 custom chip, which was used to convert the bitmap graphics from the Atari ST version to native format on the Super NES. The DSP2 had little to no documentation available, and it was impossible to dump without decapping the chip. Without the DSP2, the game was unplayable. And in 2003, 12 years after the launch of the game, DSP2 emulation was added to the emulator. And finally, Dungeon Master was playable on emulation. Before this game was not playable on any Super NES system, and it's unknown if FTL was involved in the development of the DSP2, with Dungeon Master being the only game to ever use it. Since the earliest days of arcade games, bootlegs have existed. Many arcade PCBs, or printed circuit boards, come with a manual outlining the schematics of the board and the chips. This is mainly for arcade technicians to identify if there were any issues with the boards. Bootleggers would simply replicate as best they could the contents of the motherboard, and the chips on the motherboard were simply dumped, usually with a cheap EEPROM burner. To this day, bootlegs of arcade boards are rampant, with the market flooded with them. Now you may ask why anyone would want to bootleg an arcade game. Well, like most markets, bootleggers wanted a cut of the profits and would try to sell these boards back to arcade operators at a cheaper price than the cost of an original. There were other reasons for bootlegging, of course. If you had the expertise, you could essentially make a copy of the game for yourself and replicate the arcade experience. Bootleggers would not only just make replicas of games, however, they went even further. By altering game data, sprite, tile, and code, they were able to build new games based off the games that they were working with. Here's a few examples. Not only are arcade PCB bootlegs generally frowned upon, the PCBs usually have many issues, including poor sound, graphical glitches, and much more. They also pose a greater risk of damaging the arcade cabinet if voltages on the boards were not regulated correctly. In general, most bootlegs are designed from cheaper parts, and lots of guesses and corners were cut in order to get the games to run. So we can conclude, bootlegs are bad, and arcade manufacturers wanted to put a stop to them. So they started to implement copy protection and ROM encryption. This was sometimes in the form of dedicated lockout chips that started to appear in PCBs. These chips were custom and they were not easily dumped. This meant that when bootleggers attempted to make a copy of the board, the game would not run or just contain scrambled graphics. Other games were more creative on face value, that they appeared to run fine, but they were crippled in some way. In 1985, Sega released Hang On in the arcades, which contained 2 Motorola 68000 CPUs. The game contained encrypted row data which was controlled by the second 68000. If this was missing, the track would contain no bends at all and completely kill off any incentive to play the game. There are other examples. B-Storm was released for the IGS PGM arcade hardware in 2001. While IGS-PGM runs on a Motorola 68000, some IGS-PGM cartridges contain an ARM7 CPU and custom ASIC. Without these chips, the enemies won't fire any bullets and the game is rendered unplayable. But these methods were eventually bypassed and defeated too. In some cases, arcade games contain the same copy protection across different games. So in this instance, it's just a matter of using an original board that contained the protection and then burning EEPROM chips with a different game that used the same protection scheme. This is what's known as a conversion rather than a bootleg. Although ROM encryption and different methods for protecting their games became commonplace, arcade manufacturers were facing an uphill battle to stop the bootlegging of their games. So they came up with new and interesting ways to stop hackers from getting access to game data. Encryption by itself usually wasn't enough. In the mid-80s, to store protected data, arcade manufacturers started to utilize RAM chips. Wait a minute, did I just say RAM chips? A RAM chip stands for a random access memory chip. When power is lost to this chip, it also loses the contents of this data. Arcade manufacturers would store this data on a battery backup device. If a bootleg was attempted, the data in the RAM would get wiped and render the bootleg unusable. A side effect of this, of course, was when the battery would die after a few years of usage, the game would stop dead in its tracks. And this is the origins of the term suicide battery. When we think of suicide batteries, it's easy to pin the blame on Capcom, but Sega was actually the first to use them. In 1987, they were being implemented in their System 16 arcade games. Sega's method was to use a battery to back up the RAM that holds a table for decrypting the program ROMs. To stop bootlegging, they encased both the battery and the CPU in a little black epoxy block that plugs right into the CPU socket. There were two versions of this, a Z80 block and a 68000 block. The Z80 CPU was usually for the sound, so if the battery died there would be no sound. The 68000, however, is the main CPU, and when it's dead, the game doesn't work at all. In 1988, Capcom released arcade games on the CPS-1 arcade hardware. These were some of the best games ever developed and ones that frequent retro throwback collections that you see to this day. The earlier games had no copy protection, but by 1991, with games like King of the Dragons and The Punisher, it utilized the suicide battery approach. However, the battery did not power a RAM chip, rather it powered a custom chip that displayed graphics for the game. So when the battery died, the graphics did not display correctly or at all, but this method was easy to bypass by modifying a circuit to a battery-less state. CPS-1 games were simple to revive with this method, and there was no other protection in place at all. And with this, many CPS-1 bootlegs flooded the market. Capcom went back to the drawing board and came up with arcade hardware that would take many years to defeat. In 1993, Capcom released the successor to the very popular and widely bootlegged CPS-1. Known as CPS-2 or Capcom Play System 2 hardware, every single board utilized a suicide battery. The CPS-2 came standard with very similar hardware to CPS-1, including the 68000 CPU running at 16 MHz. The sound CPU was a standard Z80 at 8 MHz. The same CPS-A and B graphics processors found in the CPS-1 were also implemented in CPS-2, and the Capcom custom Q-Sound chip for DSP processing runs at 4 MHz. CPS-2 was capable of up to 900 sprites on screen at one time, and ran at 384x224 with a 24-bit color palette. With the hardware design, Capcom was very much aware and learned its lessons from CPS-1 bootlegging. The main CPU was not exposed on the motherboard, rather it was encrypted and embedded into the Capcom DL1525 custom chip. But this time, rather than just use a simple protection system, Capcom encrypted every single CPU instruction with a decrypted table stored in the battery backed up RAM. Once this battery runs out, you guessed it, the game is lost and the PCB becomes a paperweight. Replacing the battery won't help because the RAM is already cleared. Although widely criticized and heavy-handed, this new method meant there were a total of 0 bootlegs or ROM hacks for the entire lifecycle of the hardware. That is, from 1993 to 2003, Capcom had finally beat the bootleggers. So what we have here, guys, is the Capcom CPS2 Marvel vs. Capcom game. This is the original CPS2 arcade board. Now, unfortunately, when we powered it up, as you saw, we got a green screen on my arcade machine, which is a sign that this board is completely dead. The problem with the suicide battery-based CPS2 hardware is obvious. Once it dies, it's dead forever. This meant that arcade operators either had to be diligent in replacing batteries every few years themselves, which in itself is no simple feat, or they'd need to send the boards back to Capcom, and for a fee, Capcom would provide a new battery and restore the contents of the RAM and revive the board. While all this was going on, hackers were attempting to defeat the CPS2 encryption, which was no simple feat. If you attempted to even patch a single line of code, it would result in a black screen. It looked like Capcom had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Capcom's biggest competition at the time was SNK and their Neo Geo arcade hardware. When the Neo Geo home system, the AES, was released in 1991, Capcom responded and developed their own home console known as the CPS Charger. It contained cut-down CPS hardware meant for the home, and it was an absolute failure. But one of the CPS Charger games that came for the system was Street Fighter Zero, which was a backport of a CPS2 game. When the game was dumped, it was quickly realized that this version of Street Fighter Zero was decrypted. And this meant that hackers could find important information and clues in the code that may help with the CPS2 decryption effort. The team known as CPS2 Shock made an important discovery. Street Fighter Zero has an internal debugger, and it was determined that some memory ranges were not encrypted at all. What this meant was a simple dumper program could be inserted into those blocks of code. In 2001, the very first dump of the game Street Fighter Zero was released to the public, but this was not the end of the story. This was the unencrypted dump that was extracted from the game. The encryption method and the data stored in the backup RAM was still very much unknown, and there was still no way to revive dead CPS2 boards that had suicided. The unencrypted ROMs that were added to emulators such as Final Burn Alpha and MAME, but they still didn't work on real hardware. If you attempted to put the decrypted code on a dead CPS2 board, it would not boot, and no one was really sure why. But it wasn't long until this question was answered. It was determined that when a CPS2 board loses its protected RAM and the decryption table is erased, the memory address locations for both graphics and sounds are different, and when patching them will revive the board. This is the basis of what's known as the Phoenix Edition ROM sets, a patched set of CPS2 ROMs useful for reviving dead CPS2 boards. These Phoenix ROMs also include extra features, including a jukebox and the ability to change the region of the game easily. Phoenix ROMs were also quite controversial in the scene, as the developer, Rosula, who discovered how to revive dead CPS2 boards, would charge a fee for this. Many argued that it was no different than Capcom charging for their revival service. Phoenix Edition ROMs also changed some code, which was argued that may provide a different gameplay experience. But overall, Phoenix Edition ROMs was exactly what the arcade scene needed. Finally, all CPS2 boards could be revived. So now, we can preserve all CPS2 games by dumping and patching decrypted sets and using Phoenix ROMs. But the CPS2 encryption, as of 2001, was still unknown. It wasn't until 6 years later in 2007 when the encryption algorithm was cracked by utilizing advanced mathematical techniques and custom hardware. It was determined that the algorithm used was a Feistel cipher and a 64-bit key. This meant that the now dead CPS2 boards could be revived without resorting to decrypted or Phoenix Edition sets. Although the encryption method was discovered, it was still unclear as to how Capcom would revive dead CPS2 motherboards. But in April of 2016, Artemio Urbina, Ian Court and Eduardo Cruz successfully made this possible. They were able to reverse and de-suicide any dead Capcom CPS2 motherboard without any hardware modifications. In fact, methods using simple Arduino devices can now revive any CPS2 game, and even simpler methods are out there today, including the Infinikey, which will permanently revive any dead CPS2 boards. Ultimately, Capcom learned from their failures with protection on the CPS1 board, and from Super Street Fighter 2 in 1993 to Hyper Street Fighter 2 in 2003 and all the way up to 2007, The Capcom CPS2 encryption method stood firm as one that could not be defeated, and although weaknesses were found in the code and data to ultimately allow for other methods of running these games, Capcom had successfully stopped the bootleggers in their tracks. Cartridge-based lockout chips. We first saw Nintendo utilize these all the way back in 1984. Known as the 10NES, we covered this chip and its history in a previous episode. But to summarize, a simple lock and key methodology was used to mitigate any unlicensed bootleg games on the system. With two identical chips, one installed inside the console and the other in the cartridge, they were used to lock out any unlicensed or different region games. Although it was possible to disable and circumvent this chip simply by cutting a pin from the chip, the code inside the chip was intact, and this method wasn't foolproof, and of course you would need to void your warranty. In fact, the 10NES took over 20 years for it to be cracked. It took even longer on the Super NES. Nintendo used almost the same 10NES chip on the Super NES. I say almost because although it was a variant of the same chip, it wasn't identical, it ran a different set of code. This meant that the reverse engineering efforts on the NES would not help. Just like on the NES, the Super NES had its own variant of the 10NES lockout chip, known as the CIC. It had a different set of instructions and a different set of code. And really on the Super NES, the chip was mainly used for region locking of games. But this only really represented the first line of anti-piracy on the Super Nintendo. As we'll see, more sophisticated anti-piracy techniques needed to be developed. During the heyday of the 16-bit Super NES and Sega Genesis days, disc copiers started to become very popular. A disc copier is essentially a device that plugs into the cartridge port and has its own firmware. It also includes a built-in disk drive, the same that you would find on a PC, and this would allow you to simply insert an original cartridge and you could dump the contents on the disc. It also allows you to play games directly from the disc, completely bypassing the need for the original game. You can also back up and restore save files. These disc copiers were essentially tools for piracy, based on copying being very popular on other 16-bit platforms like the Amiga and the Atari ST. The most well-known disc copier for the Super Nintendo is known as the Super Wildcard DX2. This was the Swiss Army knife of copiers and allowed you to do almost everything. But unfortunately, this form of piracy meant release and cracking groups started to get involved. Super NES games, just like others, were dumped and released and spread around the world on bulletin boards and FTP servers. As you can imagine, Nintendo was not thrilled. On the NES, there was bootlegging, sure, but disc copiers weren't really a thing back then. On the Super NES, they were affordable and easy to get, and you could buy a box of floppy disks very cheap. Nintendo was worried about people renting their games, copying them, and returning the originals. In 1994, Nintendo bought a 25% stake in Rare and became a second-party developer. Nintendo's partnership with Rare was extremely important to both companies. Rare had the experience with making quality games, and their new secret weapon, Silicon Graphics technology, was about to be utilized in their up-and-coming games Donkey Kong Country and Killer Instinct. To stop disc copiers, both Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Country would lock the game out if it knew that a copier was attached to it, or if it had loaded a ROM from floppy disk. It would present an anti-piracy message that looked like this. Nintendo also started to introduce the same anti-piracy features in other games like Earthbound and Super Punch-Out. This meant that the games needed to be cracked. Owning just a disc copy wouldn't work. You also needed to patch the ROM. So how does this anti-piracy actually work, and how does it kick in? Any Super NES game that requires a save has what's known as SRAM or save RAM. This RAM is usually quite small in size, maybe only 8 or 16 kilobytes in size depending on the game. It's built into the cartridge and connected via a battery. If the battery dies, you lose your save games. Disc copiers, on the other hand, have a much larger amount of SRAM because they want to ensure that they can manage and handle any size save file possible, and this is how the games are checked. Because any particular game knows how much SRAM is needed, it simply checks to see how much SRAM has been allocated to whatever is in the cartridge, and if it's any different to what it expects, it will display the anti-piracy message and lock up the game. So let's go ahead and see if we can trigger an anti-piracy message on the Super NES, and the best way to do this is to use an emulator such as SNES 90X. With an emulator like SNES 90X, I downloaded the source code and compiled it up on my PC. So let's go ahead and fiddle with the SRAM. In the memory class, this is the function where the SRAM is calculated from the ROM, and this is where we can hijack the SRAM value. I'm going to give it a size of 64 kilobytes, which is way larger than normal. Let's go ahead and see what happens. Running the emulator and loading Donkey Kong Country, everything seems to work fine, but as soon as you load a level, it indeed shows us the anti-piracy message. And just to prove that this is not a fluke, this also appears in Donkey Kong Country 2. If we go ahead and load up Earthbound, it displays a similar message. In fact, SRAM anti-piracy checks were introduced in late 1994. There's only around 12 games with this anti-piracy check, with most resorting to the lockout chip. The SRAM check method against a disc copier was one way that Nintendo was able to circumvent piracy, but Nintendo didn't stop there. They came up with more ingenious ways to beat the pirates. Donkey Kong Country 2 was one of the first Super NES games that introduced multi-layers of anti-piracy. The CIC region lockout and the SRAM checks came first, and incidentally, if you open up the SRAM save file that DKC2 creates, it leaves a nice little message knowing that you've tampered with the game with the words "a pirate" embedded in the code. Nice one. Another check was to test the registers of the main CPU, the 65C18. In theory, if these registers are set to their default values during boot up, then it's assumed that an original cartridge has been inserted. But if they are different than expected, it's assumed that a copier is connected and potentially running its own code. There are some additional RAM tests as well to check for copiers, which also has CRC or checksum validation. If this check fails, the memory address location 0A15 in hexadecimal, which contains a count to the total number of screens for a level, is reduced by 1. And to test this out, let's go ahead and use Donkey Kong Country 2 and a SNES 90X emulator. By hijacking and patching the memory location 0A15 hexadecimal and reduce the number of total screens count, you can see that this character is completely boxed in. This means that this level will stop scrolling and the end of the level can never be completed. There's also a reset vector check. A reset vector is essentially a pointer to a section of memory where the game boots from. Reset vectors are modified if there's a cracktro, trainer, or intro that was injected into the ROM. If this was modified, the game will have weird behavior, like barrels not breaking or being randomly kicked out of a level back to the map and not being able to proceed. Donkey Kong Country 3 also took these features and added a few more. And of course, none of these stopped expert crackers from dumping and patching the game, but it certainly made their life a lot harder. So, if there's one game that stands out in the entire Super NES's library of devious anti-piracy methods, the one that really comes to mind has to be Earthbound. Earthbound is a role-playing game known as Mother 2 in Japan. It was released in North America in 1995, right in the middle when disc copying was running rampant. The story follows Ness and his friends traveling the lands, getting into adventures, leveling up to ultimately defeat the end-evil boss Gygus. No one really liked Earthbound at launch in North America, with lukewarm reviews and sales, but the game is now a cult classic and one of the most sought after and expensive Super NES games around. Earthbound implements 4 levels of copy protection, each more devious than the one before it. Like Donkey Kong Country, regional lockout and SRAM checks are in place, but any cracker worth their salt can easily patch both of these out when they dump the ROM. But the Earthbound developers detected for these patches. By all accounts, the game appeared to work, and you could play and save your progress just fine. But the game's enemy encounter logic was amped up significantly, and there was a ton more random encounters than usual. These encounters on the beach, for example, hardly ever happen in the real game, and encounters often occurred in places where they normally wouldn't, with the game almost becoming unplayable as is. But then there's one last middle finger to the hackers and those that are playing a bootleg version. If you get to the last boss Gygus, during the battle the game freezes. The screen turns black, but the music continues, and when you reset the game to reload your saves are completely wiped clean. This is also easily tested on an emulator like SNES 90X, and surely enough, it works. There are other Super NES games that have anti-piracy measures like this, but in the end, without any form of encryption on the console meant that the hackers would always find a way. Nintendo stopped the casual disc hopping, but they couldn't prevent the experts from patching the code. Still, removing a save game right at the end is one of many methods to mitigate piracy, by letting the cracker think that he's defeated the anti-piracy when clearly he has not. And finally, going back to the CIC lockout chip, the Super NES variant of the chip was finally completely reverse engineered in 2010, with the Super CIC mod, a way to play all region games, being released. Super Nintendo Anti-Piracy. In the last episode on this series, we discussed the different methods employed to stop the pirates from making illegal copies of the games. This was done using disk copiers, which was popular hardware used to dump cartridges to floppy disk, and then utilizing the disk to play the games without ever needing the original. The majority of anti-piracy methods have one or more checks in place, but with the most basic one being based on SRAM or static RAM. This RAM manages the save game data on the cartridge. The amount of SRAM allocated on a disk copier is usually much different in size, so it's pretty simple for the game to check the amount of SRAM that it expects to see, and if it comes up with a different value, an anti-piracy message is displayed. Some games have additional checks. Earthbound would even go as far as deleting your save game if you made it through to the final boss, Gygax. But we really only took a look at a few examples in the last episode. There are more Super NES games that have anti-piracy methods in place. So, in the first episode, I got a lot of comments about games that I didn't mention that had anti-piracy measures, and some of them that I'd never even heard of before. So I thought it would be a cool idea to take a closer look at some more games on the Super NES and their anti-piracy measures, and see if we can trigger them via emulation. Demon's Crest is sometimes referred to as a sequel to Super Ghouls and Ghosts, but it's really more of a spin-off than anything. You get to play as Firebrand, one of those annoying demons from Ghosts and Goblins, in his very own adventure. The game itself is pretty cool, and quite a bit easier than Super Ghouls and Ghosts, as you can fly and stay suspended in the air. This means that you can skip over some parts of the level. For example, on the first level of the game, you can just about fly over most of it and go straight to the boss. Demon's Crest has a typical SRAM anti-piracy measure in place. But MVG, I hear you ask, Demon's Crest has no battery save, and hence no SRAM on board. So how does this work? Well, the same rules apply. With an emulator, let's force it to contain any size SRAM. If the game detects any SRAM other than 0, then it's assumed to be a pirate copy. The game lets you play for a few minutes as normal, but eventually every monster in the game becomes invulnerable. You can't even break the statues and loot items. I flew straight over to the boss fight thinking I could still beat him, but it stops you dead in your tracks. I bet there must have been lots of bad ROM dumps back in the day that would have frustrated many pirates out there. And this is one of those everything seems to work until it doesn't type of game. Another legendary Capcom game on the Super NES is Super Street Fighter II: The New Challengers. This time there are two different anti-piracy measures in place. Like Demon's Crest, the game has no SRAM, but there is a check to determine if a copier is being used. If so, controls are completely disabled. You can press start past the initial Capcom logo, but other than that, the controls are completely removed from the game. You can't do anything, and I was able to confirm this pretty easily with an emulator. The second anti-piracy measure is if the size of the ROM is larger than expected. Super Street Fighter II: The New Challengers comes on a 32 megabit or 8 megabyte cartridge. But like the SRAM check, something that disk copiers will also increase is the size of the ROM in order to compensate for all sizes of games that need to get dumped. So if the game detects a different size ROM other than 32 megabit, the game plays fine for a while, but eventually will end up with a black screen that cannot be recovered from. Okay, so the first two checks aren't too bad, but here's where things get a little crazy. Mega Man X, another game by Capcom, is the first Mega Man game for the 16-bit home consoles and the first game in the Mega Man X series. Written by Keiji Inafune, it recently received a throwback physical release to celebrate Mega Man's 30th anniversary. Mega Man X is brilliant, but the anti-piracy measures in the game can be downright cruel. The game would detect if a copy was running by the usual SRAM checks, and everything would appear to run as normal. However, some of the things you may encounter in the game are, at random you can lose all your upgrades, power-ups can disappear when you move to pick them up, player movement may get random input movement added to it, sometimes you can get teleported back to the start of the level, and if you picked up an extra life, you'd be sent back to the intro stage. And finally, sometimes you would take damage climbing walls. The game detected for the presence of these checks being patched out and would add increased anti-tamper checks, overall making the game impossible to get through. The problem for Capcom was these anti-tamper methods seemed to get triggered on original cartridges as well, causing a lot of headaches and frustration. So Capcom released the 1.1 update to prevent this. The anti-tamper method in Mega Man X is easy to replicate by adjusting SRAM in SNES 90X. Other emulators like the legendary Z-SNES won't work correctly at all with the Mega Man X 1.0 ROM. But in general, most Super NES emulators of today will run Mega Man X 1.0 without any issues at all. Another interesting anti-piracy check is Super Mario All-Stars. Just like other games, it uses a similar SRAM method to determine if a copier is being used. But in my experience, attempting to trigger the anti-piracy message does not seem to work when I adjusted the SRAM size in an emulator. In fact, the game runs fine no matter what I did. According to the website The Cutting Room Floor, there's a simple action replay code you can use to trigger the message, but that's not really much fun now, and because we're just patching memory, we're just jumping directly to that screen. So I was determined to understand how this process works better. According to The Cutting Room Floor, the game inserts a value at SRAM location 0 and then another at location hexadecimal 2000. This is where the SRAM mirror lives. Then these values are compared to each other, and if there's any difference it triggers the anti-piracy message. That seems easy enough to try, but even this does not seem to work. Changing the byte value at hexadecimal 2000 in SRAM has no effect, so I did even more digging. It turns out that the byte comparison is only one part of it. SRAM mirroring is the second part. Let's take a closer look. Inside the ROM itself, there is code that inserts a value at SRAM location 0, then the same value at SRAM hexadecimal 2000. This is the location of SRAM address mirroring for 8 kilobits of SRAM, which is what Super Mario All-Stars uses. It first inserts hexadecimal AA at these locations, and then quickly follows it up with hexadecimal 55. I'm assuming it does this as an extra safeguard. The values are then compared with each other, and if they're the same, then the program is allowed to run. And we can confirm this by loading up SNES 90X. We can see that the value hexadecimal AA is written, then quickly followed up with hexadecimal 55. However, if a disk copy was used, the SRAM address mirror would not be at hexadecimal 2000. It might be at hexadecimal 4000, 8000, depending on the size of the SRAM defined with the disk copier, which is usually much larger. So if we patch our emulation code to store the byte hexadecimal 55 at address hexadecimal 4000 to simulate a disk copier, does it trigger the anti-piracy screen? Yes, it does, and finally the mystery is solved. Another thing to mention about this particular check is that inside the ROM itself, this check is done on boot up as well as each individual game. So back in the day, hackers would have to remove the check 5 times in code in order for a working dump to run on a copier. Pretty clever stuff. Now, there are some games that have documented anti-piracy measures which I believe aren't actually real. And the one that really comes to mind is Chrono Trigger by Squaresoft. Chrono Trigger supposedly has a very interesting anti-piracy measure in place, but it's something that I can't trigger at all. According to different reports that I've read, Chrono Trigger on the Super NES has a standard SRAM anti-piracy check. It checks for a different amount, which is fairly normal, and if it finds something unexpected, once Chrono enters the time travel machine, he's stuck in an infinite loop during the sequence. Now this check is 100% confirmed on the Nintendo DS version, but on the original Super NES game, I can't get it to trigger no matter what I do. Now, I do believe that there must be some anti-tamper measure in place because this was a very big game back in the day, and I do believe that Squaresoft must have been very concerned about the rampant copying that was going on at the time. So I am convinced there must be some anti-tamper measure in place, but I do think it's a little more complicated than just a simple SRAM check. Now, if you happen to know about this, or you've had it happen to you before, please leave a comment below. I'd be very happy to try and see if I can reproduce this one. One last thing to mention is that there are reports of false positives that come up on real cartridges. This is usually when connections are dirty and not making contact, but a simple cleaning of the contact will resolve this issue. But sometimes when you turn off the Super NES console and turn it back too quick, there is a different error that's triggered. In this example, in Donkey Kong Country 3, while not specifically anti-piracy, it still locks the user out of the game. The reason for this is because it takes a few seconds to clear out the Super NES's main memory in its entirety on power down, so powering up the Super NES during this time may result in system memory that's corrupted, and the cartridge may think that some backup or other device is connected to the system. And this one is pretty easy to emulate. Rather than not zeroing out main memory, we just give it some random byte values and then start the emulation. As you can see, this particular method is easily triggered. It's been said that DRM, anti-tamper, or anti-piracy measures are also anti-consumer. In other words, they hurt the end user more than they help. As an example, many PC games from older times simply won't run on modern PCs. Digital-only console games may get removed from digital storefronts due to licensing issues or simply because the storefront inevitably will shut down. It's true, however, that some of these issues have been addressed. Thanks to sites like GOG who offer DRM-free versions of older games, usually running under DOSBox, which is a DOS and Windows emulator that plays nice with modern systems. And on the consoles, games from older generations may get a remaster or end up on a collection. But this isn't always the case. Many games simply will never be brought forward. But there is also another consideration. Games development is expensive, and if these DRM and anti-tamper measures weren't implemented, the argument is that it would account for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions in lost revenue. By simply making copies of games on CDs without protection may lead to reduced sales. And almost every development company out there has to deal with piracy, and different companies dealt with it in different ways, some more successfully than others. For a company like EA, they learned a hard lesson with the game Spore. A disastrous heavy-handed DRM measure forced users to download pirated versions in order to play the game that they actually paid for. If you were a PC gamer in the late 90s to 2000s, you were probably right at home with games coming on CD. Almost every game required the CD to be in the drive at all times. If you made a copy of the disc and tried to use the copy instead of the original, the game was usually smart enough to know it was a copy. And there was also CD virtual drives. An application known as Daemon Tools would install a virtual drive on your PC and allow you to mount an ISO image to it. Essentially, Windows believes that it was just another CD drive. But some CD anti-tamper DRMs were able to detect the presence of virtual drives. These DRM CD protections did not stop piracy. In response, the scene started releasing what was known as no CD cracks. Simple patches to the executable or game files to essentially strip out these CD authentication checks. While these cracks' main purpose was for piracy, of course, ironically, today, many of these no CD cracks are essential for playing vintage PC games on a modern PC. By the early 2000s, CD DRM measures had become increasingly sophisticated. A Russian company known as Protection Technology released a new DRM that was known as StarForce. At a glance, this just looked like another CD authentication check protection mechanism, but in reality, it was anything but. Before StarForce, most CD-based protection was essentially a key or digital signature pressed onto a disk that was impossible or very difficult to copy. StarForce used a different approach that was multi-tiered. First of all, the executable and many of its game files were encrypted. Each master disk has individual physical parameters that are unique to each disk that's pressed. Those parameters make up a unique 24-byte key. That key is also embedded into the executable and files of the game. The protection simply is if the physical parameters of the disk match the key embedded in the executable and the disk is in the physical drive, the game will pass its protection check and boot. Simple enough? StarForce began appearing in games as early as 2003. By 2005, it was at its third revision, and Splinter Cell Chaos Theory by Ubisoft took over 400 days to crack. This was unprecedented. Anti-piracy methods like SecuROM and SafeDisk were annoying enough for most end users, but they were easily defeated by hackers pretty quickly and easily. But StarForce was something else entirely. With over 400 days to crack Splinter Cell Chaos Theory on the PC, this was a next level form of protection. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how it actually works. Since the early days of Windows NT, there has been security implemented in all Windows operating systems. Just like something like Linux, where you have user administration and even root level access, Windows has a similar thing, tiers or levels of privilege known as rings. Ring 3 is user or application level, so any utility, game or code you write will run at this level. Rings 1 and 2 are generally not used by Windows, and Ring 0 is the kernel level, the highest tier, where you have unrestricted access to the entire operating system, the keys to the castle if you will. We mentioned earlier that StarForce gathered the native physical parameters of the CD. In order to achieve this, StarForce would silently install a device driver in Windows known as the StarForce Protection Driver, and depending on the version of StarForce, something else known as a VFS driver, which we'll come back to in a minute. Early versions of StarForce would install these drivers on the target machine at Ring O level, with full and unrestricted access to the user's machine and hardware, which did not even inform the user. As you can imagine, this was a cause for some concern. It's also worth noting that most games contain a EULA or End User License Agreement, which outlines the agreement between the user and the license in place. There is no mention of StarForce in any EULAs in any games that supported StarForce. But let's go back to the protection. The VFS driver is for the virtual file system. StarForce creates a small virtual machine on the target machine which can contain one or many of the game data files, which are usually encrypted. Essentially, any StarForce game can be running in real mode, then access the virtual machine to decrypt and read files from, and then return back to real mode. There was no universal standard on how protection was established. It varied from game to game and was extremely difficult to crack. In the past, for SecuROM, there were generic patcher tools. In this case, it would simply not apply for StarForce. Attempting to crack StarForce was very challenging. Generally speaking, a hacker would use a debugger that could access the kernel or at the Ring O level. Soft Ice was a very popular kernel debugger at the time. But the crackers relied on using a method known as int3. By sending an interrupt to the debugger would temporarily replace an instruction in a running program in order to set a breakpoint. This meant the hacker would get a good look at the running code and come up with ways to bypass protection checks. StarForce would simply check for those interrupts and redirect them elsewhere to throw the debuggers off. In fact, int3 was used as part of the protection itself. Make no mistake, StarForce was some of the best anti-piracy, anti-tamper that was ever created. But this all came at a cost. End users started to learn about what StarForce was doing to their PCs, installing device drivers at the highest level of privilege with no real understanding of what it was doing is an absolute red flag. Worse still, uninstalling games that use StarForce such as Race Driver 2, Broken Sword 3 and Silent Storm did not remove StarForce itself. The problem was StarForce left lots of residual files behind, and it wasn't an easy task to clean all traces of the DRM off a machine, and in the end a dedicated StarForce removal tool was developed for this purpose. Then there was the problem with the dual CD-ROM drives. If you had more than one CD drive connected, StarForce would not pass its authentication check unless you physically disconnected one. StarForce was also included on many game demos. The reasoning was that the game companies did not want hackers referring to the demo to find clues on how to crack the main game when it came out. Many users started reporting issues with their PCs after StarForce protected games were installed. Complaints about slow CD-ROM speeds, blue screens of death, random reboots, and more were common. The company denied this, but because of the kernel-level access to the system meant that these crashes could not be ruled out. It was found out that StarForce would sometimes step down the IDE speeds and in some cases even disable DMA or direct memory access of the CD-ROM drive. This meant that you could no longer play audio CDs, for example. This was also confirmed by PC Gamer magazine editor at the time, Greg Vederman, who stated,
"Last year my work PC suddenly began blue screening anytime I popped an audio CD into either of my two optical drives. I went online and learned that other people were having the same problem and that it appeared to be StarForce related. Deleting my StarForce protected games did nothing. I had to run a StarForce removal utility before my system, filled only with legal, licensed software, could play audio CDs again."
By 2006, the backlash for StarForce was immense, with many users and websites labeling it as a rootkit, malware, or even a Trojan. Users would often turn to the developers to ask for help with StarForce, only to be told that they should contact StarForce directly. At the time, Ubisoft was the largest publisher of games that used StarForce and was subject to a $5 million lawsuit.
Due to Ubisoft's intentional use of the highly controversial copy protection scheme StarForce, despite user protests and purposeful deletion of any forum discussions about the protection, Christopher Spence has filed a $5 million lawsuit against the company for use of crippling DRM in their games. StarForce has been reported to cause system instability, slowdowns, and possible damage to optical drives, as well as questionable business practices when dealing with customers and other companies.
While the case was dropped due to lack of evidence, it didn't really matter. The public outcry and perception that this DRM was a rootkit spread like wildfire. Ubisoft ran a user poll on their forums, and the overwhelming response was against its use. Ubisoft then dropped StarForce in favour of the competition, SecuROM. But StarForce held firm, offering no apologies for their DRM methods. In fact, they went after and threatened lawsuits on people who spoke out against it. Cory Doctorow, whose website Boycott StarForce, was threatened with a lawsuit unless he removed the insults, lies, and false accusations. StarForce PR also sidestepped the EULA question by arguing that it didn't matter if StarForce was not explicitly mentioned. If you clicked "I agree", then you are agreeing to it, even though it came installed as a hidden device driver. But to be fair, StarForce did later on reduce its privileges from Ring 0 to Ring 3 and listen to customer feedback. There is also questions about the validity of the claims causing problems to users' PCs. StarForce offered large sums of cash for people who could replicate problems that many had reported. These were never claimed. Most of these problems are addressed with the release of the StarForce removal tool. But the StarForce PR did not handle this well either.
According to our research, those of users that do run into compatibility problems are beginner-level hackers that try to go around our protection system.
What can't be questioned, however, is the underhanded approach. The hidden device drivers, the fact that it leaves traces behind, the uninstall utility was also called into question whether it cleaned everything up. End users began boycotting StarForce games because they just didn't want to deal with the problems and any potential issues on their PCs. The legacy left behind of StarForce is also worth mentioning. From Windows Vista onward, attempting to install a StarForce game, such as Peter Jackson's King Kong, would almost certainly blue screen, and in many instances require a complete reinstall of the operating system. It would also get stuck in repair mode, and safe mode would also not work. These issues were so bad that newer versions of most games like the Steam release of King Kong and Splinter Cell Chaos Theory had StarForce protection removed. But other games like Trackmania Sunrise simply cannot be played on a modern PC, and the game developers aren't interested in the removal of StarForce because it's a low priority issue. In September of 1996, after numerous delays, the Nintendo 64 was launched in North America to critical acclaim. The Super Nintendo, towards the end of its life, was starting to feel a little dated. With games like Killer Instinct coming to the arcades, the Super Nintendo version was impressive, but its lack of 3D was starting to show. The Nintendo 64 was the system that brought 3D into the household. It came stock with impressive hardware, all thanks to the Reality coprocessor chip, something that you would normally spend hundreds of dollars on for a 3D effects card on your PC. but somehow it was all squeezed into a small motherboard and for only $199 US. Nintendo invested heavily on the hardware, even with the decision to stick with cartridges. While initially proving unpopular, especially compared to the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, it ended up being the right move for Nintendo at the time. But what about security? The Super Nintendo was one of the most pirated game consoles going around. You could easily buy a disc copier like an MGD2 or a Super Wildcard, connect it up and play games from floppy disk, or you could even rent and borrow games from your local Blockbuster and dump them to disk. The Super NES used a CIC lockout chip just like on the original NES. Every licensed game cartridge would contain this chip and there would be an identical one on the console. Both the CIC chips would communicate with each other in step to validate that the game being played was not a bootleg. The concept goes back to the early 80s. The same CIC lockout paradigm was used on the NES. However, the chip could have been circumvented simply by disabling the circuit. On the NES, developers did not only rely on the CIC to protect their games, but they added additional protection checks around SRAM and other measures. But in the end, while these measures were a minor deterrent, expert crackers knew how to defeat all of the different anti-piracy measures, and games were uploaded to FTP sites worldwide. Nintendo knew that they had a fight on their hands with the Nintendo 64. The Super NES was widely pirated as a console system with a simple disc copier that connected into the cartridge port. You were able to rip your games pretty easily. So with the Nintendo 64, Nintendo decided to use a more sophisticated approach, but they didn't really deviate too far away from the approach on the Super Nintendo and the NES before it, and continued to stick with the CIC security lockout chip on the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 carried over the CIC chip from the NES and Super NES, and you're probably wondering, why would they have done this considering it's easy to circumvent the protection? Nintendo knew that CIC chips were easy to bypass, so they came up with a more sophisticated method for the Nintendo 64. Each game cartridge still uses a custom CIC chip, but this time around, on the console motherboard there is no matching chip. Rather, the CIC from the cartridge communicates with a chip known as a Peripheral Interface Bus, or PIF. The PIF has a few uses. It contains the IPL, or Initial Program Loader, or boot code. In other words, when the Nintendo 64 is turned on, the boot code from the PIF is first executed. The PIF also handles inputs from peripherals such as the controllers, but its main use is security, where it manages region protection and anti-tampering. This time around, the CIC and the PIF do not communicate in step, so there's no easy way just to disable the circuit. If you attempt to do that, the game will simply not boot. In fact, when game copies and backup devices were released for the Nintendo 64, they all relied on the use of an original cartridge for its CIC chip to interface with the PIF. There was no easy method of booting anything on the N64 without a CIC. Even as late as 2014, with the arrival of EverDrive 64 cartridges, the EverDrive 64 would require a donor CIC chip that was taken from an original game to work correctly. Just like the NES and Super NES CIC chips, on the Nintendo 64 at the time there was no known way to crack the protection. But more on that later. To add further complexity, there were multiple CIC chips with a total of 5 different variants across both PAL and NTSC. The CIC 6102 is considered the standard chip for the majority of games, but not all. This meant that if you owned a backup device and used a donor cartridge with a 6102, but wanted to play Star Fox 64 that used a 6101, it simply would not work. Like any computer program or game console, the Nintendo 64 has an address location in memory where the boot process starts. This is known as the entry point or boot vector, and it's located on the N64 at this hexadecimal location. To further add complexity, 2 variations of the CIC chip would also relocate this entry point as an additional security measure. Just like in the days of the Super Nintendo, the CIC lockout chip wasn't always enough protection for some developers, and in the case of Rare, they added additional protection to games like Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, as well as Killer Instinct with some additional checks around SRAM. On the Nintendo 64, things were quite similar. Although a backup device required an original cartridge with a CIC chip in place in order for that chip to communicate with the PIF chip, companies like Rare decided to add some additional checks in some of their games to stop the pirates from spreading around and ripping their games and leaking them onto the internet. Just like on the Super NES, second-party developer Rare began to incorporate additional security checks in order to make life difficult for pirates. Rare knew that adding a donor CIC on a backup device would work around pretty much any issue, so additional checks were added into the code. Donkey Kong 64 was one such game. It used a 6105 CIC chip in North America, which was only used by a handful of other games. We mentioned earlier that any backup device would require a donor CIC chip, such as the 6102, which was the most popular and commonly used. However, the game would still boot and play if it detected a 6102, but at random during any points of the game it would erase all save data. Jet Force Gemini was another title that used this stealth approach. It also contained a 6105, and if it located a different variant of a CIC chip during the game, all of the weapons were disabled and you could not run at full speed. But even still with this, the security on the Nintendo 64 stood firm for years, with only a very small handful of unauthorized or bootleg cartridges ever released. So this is my early EverDrive 64 cartridge, and this one has the 6102 CIC chip, and as you can see, when I play Jet Force Gemini, the anti-piracy is triggering here. You can see that it's running slow and I cannot shoot with my character. Although there were ways to bypass security on the Nintendo 64, for over 20 years the CIC chip stood firm and was not yet defeated. Now you could argue that, well, it was easy enough just to bypass it from the earliest Dr. V64s all the way up to the earliest or the first revisions of the EverDrive cartridges simply by providing a donor CIC chip, and that will certainly get you around the security mechanism. But what was not yet really understood was what the program code was doing inside the CIC chip, and that was all the way up to the early 2010s when some smart security researchers decided to take a look at the internal workings of the CIC chip on the Nintendo 64 by utilizing sophisticated decapping techniques. As with most security systems, hackers were curious and wanted to learn the secrets of the CIC chip on the Nintendo 64. The code itself was not accessible, and if you attempted to capture the data between the chip and the PIF, it would just send back and forth a random stream of bytes. On the NES, a lucky break was discovered when a debug line was located on the clone Tengen Rabbit chip, which exposed the inner working of that chip. But on the Nintendo 64, there is no easy way of dumping the chip other than a process known as decapping. Still, this did not deter people. Emulation also played a huge part. Popular emulator Project 64 contained these challenge response data calls returned from the CIC. This enabled games like Banjo-Tooie and Jet Force Gemini to bypass its anti-piracy. From this data alone, hackers were able to reverse engineer the algorithm for the 6105 chip, which meant that emulators could now boot these ROMs and make them playable. In 2015, security researchers Mike Ryan, John McMaster and Marshall H. worked together to expose the inner workings of the CIC and PIF chips. The method was to decap both chips and understand the inner working. It was revealed that both chips contained sharp SM5 4-bit microprocessors, and from here they were able to learn the challenge response flow between the two chips. High level, it works something like this. When the Nintendo 64 is powered on, and assuming there's a working cartridge in place, the PIF sends a random set of values to the CIC. The CIC then sends a response back, and the sequence continues back and forth until the power on the N64 is turned off. This means that a swap trick approach won't work. A valid CIC must always exist and interface with the PIF. The PIF contains a small area of RAM that contains code. This code is used to determine the checksum and region from the CIC. This information is sent back to the PIF, and if it doesn't match what's expected, then the game is locked out. If all matches up, then the PIF sends data back to the CIC and lets it know that all is good, and the main game then boots up. But as mentioned earlier, the communication between the PIF and the CIC never stops. Once the chips were decapped, the program code was able to be extracted. With this information, an SM5 emulator was developed on a PC, and with some trial and error over time, the team was able to reproduce the algorithm for the 6105. There were also some interesting things discovered. The checksum that is generated by the CIC at boot time is encoded by the PIF with a key that's random based on delay, and also discovered was that the encryption key used to decode the seed data from the CIC is always hexadecimal B5. And with all this discovery and breakthrough, the ultimate goal is to develop and open source these findings, and that's exactly what happened. The Ultra CIC clone chip was developed that replicates the CIC copy protection that can be burnt onto a PIC16 microcontroller. These clone chips meant that the SD-based cart readers like the EverDrive 64 would no longer require the use of original CIC chips that were removed from other games. The Ultra CIC is now a standard with all EverDrive cartridges and aftermarket homebrew cartridges. And with the current version 3 model, they are able to detect the region of the game and automatically switch to that region. In the past, the region needed to be set on the board itself. So in conclusion, did Nintendo really stop piracy on the Nintendo 64? In many ways, no they didn't. Recall that the earliest emulator, Ultra HLE, released in 1999. Since that time, Nintendo 64 emulation has always been improving. There were also backup copiers. They weren't cheap, however, and required you to use an original game, and hopefully you would have one with a CIC that was compatible with the majority of games. On the other hand, Nintendo all but stamped out the unlicensed bootlegs of their games with this hardware, and it wasn't until over 20 years later where the chip was cloned and made available to the public. Whichever way you believe to be true, it's an amazing feat that Nintendo stuck with the same security method and same sharp 4-bit CPU CIC chips for 3 generations of their console, something that we will most likely never see happen again. The Dreamcast was designed to take advantage of fast 3D arcade hardware to bring the arcade experience to the home. The Dreamcast hardware was also used in its arcade counterpart, the Sega Naomi, which I've covered in a previous episode of the show. The Dreamcast comes with 4 controller ports, and there was a selection of different peripherals you could connect up, including keyboards, mice, dedicated joysticks, light guns, and other custom controllers. It was also the first console to come standard with a built-in modem for online play. Games came on GD-ROMs as opposed to regular CDs. Sega partnered with Yamaha and came up with the GD-ROM format in 1998. GD-ROMs, short for gigabyte discs, were 1 GB in size and unreadable by general CD or DVD drives that you'd find on a PC beyond the first track, which was the audio track. Attempting to play a GD-ROM Dreamcast disc in a PC or CD player usually results in this message.
Warning! This disc is for use only on Sega Dreamcast.
Sometimes this message varied depending on the game you played, but the result was always the same.
This disc is for use only on Sega Dreamcast.
GD-ROMs were only made by Sega, and you couldn't just go out to the store and buy a 10-pack of blank GD-ROMs. Incidentally, I covered the arcade counterpart, the Sega Naomi, on the channel last year. They also used the same GD-ROM format discs as the Dreamcast, but with a slightly different file structure. And a Dreamcast won't read these discs either. But let's go back to the Sega Dreamcast and take a closer look at a game disc. The inner or darker area is the lower density area that's readable by a standard PC or DVD drive that will read the audio track that we talked about before, and this is typically 35 megabytes in size. The other remaining 984 megabytes makes up the lighter area of the disc, which contains the game data itself. GD-ROMs are very sophisticated copy protection. Not only can DVD and CD players only read the first 35 megabytes as an audio track, there is no way of reading the contents of the disc. So how was this protection defeated? To answer that, we need to understand the boot process of the Dreamcast. When you insert a standard GD-ROM into the Dreamcast, it looks for 2 files. The first is called ip.bin, and it contains metadata about the game itself, the name of the game, the region, the peripherals, and if it supports things like VGA or light guns. It will also display the Sega license screen. The metadata information also contains the game executable name, and this is the second file that gets accessed after ip.bin has finished loading. It's usually called first_read.bin, and this will begin the boot up of the game proper. Why are these files then so important? Because with both of these files you can boot and run any Dreamcast game and defeat the GD-ROM security. So how was this accomplished? The Dreamcast not only could boot from GD-ROMs, it could also boot regular CDs with a format known as MIL CD. Like most consoles at the time, the Sega Dreamcast wanted to include multimedia features. MIL CDs were multimedia discs used for karaoke on the Dreamcast. There's a total of 7 titles that were ever made, with the most popular being an add-on to Space Channel 5. They added multimedia functions to audio discs like karaoke and other features, but they never really took off outside of Japan. But Sega knew if a user attempted to insert a MIL CD in the drive, it would look for ip.bin like it did before, and if it located it, it would attempt to boot firstboot.bin like before. And because these were regular CDs, it meant that a user could then make a copy of the MIL CD and boot from it. But this process did not work. Sega knew a thing or two about copy protection, and their solution was to scramble firstboot.bin into different parts of memory, essentially corrupting the game executable. This meant that the Dreamcast would know that the disc was pirated and effectively stop it dead in its tracks. So to summarize what we know, we have the GD-ROM, which is the custom 1GB format that was developed by Sega and Yamaha, and GD-ROMs are unreadable by PC and DVD drives. And then we have the CD and MIL CDs. Now, even if we were able to extract the contents of a GD-ROM and burn it onto a CD, which is readable by the Dreamcast, it would still not boot because the executable would get corrupted or scrambled, therefore rendering the copy of the game useless. But unfortunately for Sega, and fortunately for hackers, depending on which way you look at it, there was a quick workaround for this that was discovered by use of a Sega Katana, which is the development kit for the Sega Dreamcast. The story goes that well-known cracking and release group Utopia found a discovery on the Sega Katana SDK, which is commercial software used to develop Dreamcast games. They identified by replicating the MIL CD format that there was a simple way to reverse scramble the firstboot.bin executable file onto the CD. They essentially took the corrupted and scrambled firstboot.bin that was in memory after booting into a copied CD and applied that to the CD image itself. Therefore, when the game booted, it would unscramble the executable into memory as a single complete file and boot into the game. Security Lesson 101: don't make any type of encryption reversible. Incidentally, I've looked through much of the Sega documentation on the Katana SDK and I can't find any mention of any type of unscrambler or API call that does this. I suspect that this was more of a word of mouth thing from someone internal at Sega or undocumented feature, and while I'm at it, if anyone here is familiar with how Utopia made this discovery, hit me up in the comments below or send me an email. But in the end, the MIL CD exploit was the root cause of the failure of the copy protection, and once Utopia exploited the MIL CD, then they came out with their popular Utopia disc, a CD that booted in MIL CD format and then would be able to launch any firstboot.bin executable from a copied CD, ultimately defeating the copy protection without a mod chip. So we've learnt how the copy protection was ultimately defeated on the Sega Dreamcast, but there's still one question that needs to be answered. How did these release groups extract the contents of game GD-ROMs and ultimately package them up to be able to be burnt onto a 700 megabyte CD? Because the Katana SDK was available and Utopia had access to the development hardware, they quickly developed an application to dump the contents of a GD-ROM. The Dreamcast had serial communications, and by using a simple cable called a coder's cable, with an app on the PC could transfer the contents of the GD-ROM image over to the PC. This process took many hours, but over the lifespan of the Dreamcast, other methods of ripping GD-ROMs were identified and this process was streamlined, including using the broadband adapter to significantly speed up the process. The release groups also had to figure out how to squeeze a 1GB rip of a GD-ROM game onto 700 megabytes of a CD-ROM. They would compress video and audio files to lower the file sizes, but in some instances completely removed them. Then they repacked the games with the MIL CD bootloader that could be then burnt onto a regular CD. Sega removed the MIL CD functionality in the second revision of the Dreamcast. Incidentally, in order to know if your Dreamcast supports MIL CD, simply turn it over and look for a number in the circle. If it's a 0 or 1, it's supported. If it's a 2, it means you're out of luck and MIL CD has been removed. The early days of PC gaming on DOS and Windows were great. Most games took up less than a single megabyte and could fit on a floppy disk. By the time Doom came out in 1993, VGA graphics were standard and game storage had increased. Games would come on multiple disks, as much as 5 or 6 for some of the larger games. Floppy disks were the main source of media storage. That is until 1993 when Broderbund released Myst, initially a Mac-only title, but it was a game that sparked sales of CD-ROM drives. And on the PC, the game Seventh Guest by Trilobite was regarded as the killer app and was responsible for kickstarting the sale of PC CD-ROM drives and making it a standard. It was a multimedia experience like no other, and the CD revolution was among us. By the time Windows 95 was released, PC CD-ROM drives were standard on every computer that you would purchase in stores. But just like the consoles, games on the PC was no stranger to software piracy. Floppy disk games were simple to copy, even with unreadable sectors on the disk. Games were cracked in a matter of hours and spread around the world on FTP sites and bulletin boards. With CD-ROM games taking over as the standard, software publishers came up with different ways to stop end users attempting to duplicate or make copies of the discs. During the first few years, this wasn't a problem, but as CD burners were first revealed in the mid-90s, although initially expensive and slow, it wasn't long before they became affordable and a part of any standard PC setup. One of the earliest forms of CD-ROM copy protection was to press CDs with more data than a regular CDR could hold. A standard CD holds around 700 megabytes of data, but some games came on discs that held more data. This meant that you couldn't copy the entire disc. This approach was flawed for two reasons. The first is usually that the extra data found on the disc was just filler and could have just been removed and a normal size CD was burnt anyway. The second was that CD burner technology was improving at a rapid pace and was capable of what was known as overburning the additional data and make a copy of the disk anyway. Another approach was to use what was known as a fake table of contents. Like floppy disks, CDs contain metadata about the size of the disk, the files contained on it, how large they are, their timestamps, and more. This information is known as the TOC, or Table of Contents. Some games introduced a fake table of contents to trick Windows into believing that the disk contained over 1 GB of data and confuse the CD writer into believing that it couldn't copy the disk. Tomb Raider 3 was one such game. But these methods were crude implementations to stop casual copying, but dedicated cracking groups were able to circumvent these protection methods pretty easily. So companies started to innovate and get more advanced in copy protection, and one of the most infamous forms of copy protection that was released in the late 90s was known as SecuROM. SecuROM was the next generation of CD disk protection under Windows and was originally introduced in the late 90s. It was one of the most well-known copy protection methods and was developed by Sony, which had a fabrication plant in Austria where they had technology that pressed CDs with data that could not be copied by CDRs. The security itself is straightforward. The mastering process assigns a unique key to each individual CD, which is stored in the sub-channel data. This key cannot be copied by a CD burner. When a game is started, it attempts to retrieve the key and use it to decrypt parts of the executable. If the key cannot be located or any other condition, then the SecuROM check fails. The disk must have been copied. It's also worth noting that the CD must be kept in the CD drive to launch the game, even though you installed it onto the PC's hard disk. While the method sounds simple and easy to bypass, SecuROM was a much more sophisticated system than anything else before it. The way that it was ultimately cracked is as follows. Remember, when you put a copy of a SecuROM game into a CD drive and boot it, it simply exits, it just won't boot. SecuROM, it doesn't actually use the Windows API function to access the CD-ROM drive. It triggers an interrupt from the Microsoft CD-ROM extensions, or MSC DEX. The executable contains encrypted code, and when launched, this code is decrypted with the unique key on the disk and modifies itself into memory. But how do you modify code that's already running? Self-modifying code is something that some games use in order to confuse and mitigate cracking attempts. With earlier operating systems like Windows 95, it was possible to modify any code resident in memory, which can be achieved by a simple Windows API call such as write process memory. A typical early SecuROM games calls write process memory 4 times on an original CD, but running a copy will only call it 3 times and fail. The earliest cracks essentially captured and decrypted output from these self-modifying calls, and by essentially replicating the decrypted output of the game by using a tool known as soft dice, the executable could be patched to return a 0 on write process memory, in other words success on every single call, and just apply the decrypted output inside the executable. This meant that the game could start without a CD in the drive. These were known as the no CD cracks, and because a SecuROM CD contains no unreadable tracks on the disc, it meant that you could make a copy of the disc and then download a no CD crack for the game and play it that way. As with all anti-tamper methods, SecuROM had problems. Sometimes, even with an original disc inserted, it would not detect that the disc was in the drive. And in the worst case, it would just flat out not work at all with certain CD drive brands. There was really no way of knowing. It didn't take long for SecuROM cracks to start coming out, and while each game required its own crack, otherwise known as a no CD crack, SecuROM itself was far from done. In fact, the company really doubled down on its product and started to introduce online authentication on top of the existing SecuROM CD checks. By the early 2000s, many people had internet access. SecuROM began introducing online activation DRM on top of existing CD checks. These early versions were simply to validate that a legitimate key was being applied to the game. But by the mid-2000s, all that was about to change with one of the biggest PC releases to date. Will Wright was the developer of SimCity and The Sims. In 2005, he announced Spore, a real-time strategy god game that allowed the player to begin life as a microscopic organism and journey all the way through interstellar exploration and beyond. Its massive scope, procedural generation, and open-ended sandbox style appealed to many, especially strategy game enthusiasts. The game was a life simulation and Will Wright was at the helm. It even included music and sound produced by the legendary Brian Eno. The game suffered multiple delays during its development cycle. Perhaps it was too ambitious, but was ultimately released in 2008 to generally positive reviews. Although the consensus was it may not have lived up to the hype, it was still a good game. Not so good, however, was the SecuROM. Spore had one of the most heavy-handed and frustrating online activation DRMs that left many users unable to play the game. And keep in mind that Spore is a single-player game. Publisher Electronic Arts proudly announced that Spore would earn more in revenue by reducing piracy of the game and stopping the second-hand market. When the game was released, it required online validation every 10 days. But due to the massive outcry, this re-authentication was quickly dropped. Each legitimate copy of the game used a key that could only be authenticated on up to 3 computers. So even if you uninstall the game on all of your computers, attempting to install a 4th time would fail. And it was also noted that the game needed to re-authenticate on the same system if some hardware was changed. For example, if you replaced your graphics card or RAM, it would constitute a different computer. In response to these complaints, the cap was raised to 5 computers, and after 5 activations, then you would need to contact customer service, who may or may not have granted further activations based on your situation. SecuROM was also not disclosed on the box, and in September of 2008, a class action lawsuit was filed against EA regarding the disclosure of the DRM, which at this point ran just like a rootkit and remained on the hard drive and was very difficult to remove even when the game was uninstalled. In the end, the DRM was cracked and Spore ended up as one of the most pirated PC games to date. Within the first week of release, it was already downloaded over 500,000 times on torrent sites. Maxis developer Chris Harris labelled SecuROM on Spore a totally avoidable disaster. EA had learned their lesson from the whole situation and began selling the game with the SecuROM completely removed, but 4 months after the release of the game is a lifetime, and sales by this point had slowed down to a trickle. The DRM completely killed off the game. It never stood a chance. But Spore was not the only game. SecuROM with online activations were also used in popular EA titles including Mass Effect Dragon Age and Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. And fast forward even to the last 5 years with the release of Windows 10, which still causes headaches for SecuROM games. Microsoft considers early DRM like SecuROM a security flaw, and will not allow the games to be read from CD. Recall earlier that we said that the code modifies itself by attaching to its process and patching bytes. That's something that's a big no-no in Windows 10, so any SecuROM disk will simply not run without a no CD patch. Microsoft themselves consider SecuROM a vulnerability, but the game publishers seem okay with providing customers with an unhappy experience in the short term to ensure that the first week of sales aren't affected, but don't consider the legacy of a game that you may want to replay 10 years later. It just may not even work anymore thanks to the heavy-handed DRM measures. And I guess the last word should be, if you bought and own a SecuROM game, you will always continue to have issues, and you have my condolences. Thank God for GOG and no CD cracks. In 1990, Nintendo would release a game called StarTropics. When we think about the NES, it has a long history of classic franchises that began on the hardware. Mario, Zelda, Metroid, and even StarTropics. Developed by Nintendo R&D 3, StarTropics was an interesting game for a few reasons. The first is that it never released in Japan, even though it was internally developed by Nintendo R&D 3. The second is that it's the very first NES title that featured a form of anti-piracy which took inspiration from the PC market. The game box itself would contain a letter that would form the basis of the anti-piracy. The catch, however, was that this letter needed to be submerged in water to reveal a secret code. Once the code was discovered, you could enter it into the game and then the game would continue on as normal. And it's at this point you have to ask the question, is this truly anti-piracy, or was it Nintendo's ongoing battle with the rental market, which is very well documented? Or simply, was it just a fun gimmick as a part of the game? Well, let's go ahead and dig deeper. StarTropics is a classic action-adventure game that follows the story of Mike Jones, a teenage baseball player who travels to Sea Island in the South Seas to visit his uncle, Dr. Stephen Jones. When Mike arrives at Sea Island, he heads to the village of Coral Cola, but he finds that Dr. Jones has gone missing and sets out on a tropical island adventure to find him. Mike Jones is armed only with a yo-yo as his main weapon, but as you progress through the game you uncover more powerful and unique items. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Mike Jones, Coral Cola, yo-yos, Dr. Jones as an archaeologist? This game sounds like something from a Hollywood movie, and you would be correct. StarTropics was specifically designed to appeal to Western audiences, even though it was developed in-house in Japan by Nintendo themselves. As you explore the world of StarTropics, you uncover not only overland areas but dungeons that contain puzzles and secrets and of course boss encounters. The game is separated into chapters, each with their own sub-story and adventure to uncover. And it's also no real secret that the game does take some influence from the original Legend of Zelda. I mean, take a look at the hearts and even the character creation screen as an example. But to be clear, this is its own story in a unique tropical setting. StarTropics is really a fun game that's worth a look if you've never experienced it before. It's one of those games that Nintendo has brought forward to modern audiences. In 2008, Nintendo would bring StarTropics to the Wii Virtual Console. Then in 2016, make it available for the NES Classic in North America. And even more recently, in 2019, was added as a part of the NSO service on the Nintendo Switch. As you progress through the game, in Chapter 4 specifically, Mike gets sucked into the mouth of a large whale, where he locates Babu, Dr. Jones's assistant. Both trapped inside the whale, you must find a way to escape, which involves finding Babu's lighter and starting a fire inside the whale. Upon doing this and escaping successfully, you discover that Dr. Jones has been abducted by aliens. Babu tells Mike, "Okay Mike, I have to tell you Dr. J's last words. Evil aliens from a distant planet tell Mike to dip my letter in water." The letter that Dr. Jones sent Mike a few weeks ago, of course, is referring to the letter that comes within the game packaging itself. Once you return to your sub, the game will ask you to input the frequency which enables the navigation system on the submarine to track Dr. Jones's location. And at this point, the game gives you another hint, but this time much more direct, that you need to put water on Dr. J's letter in the instruction booklet. The code is revealed when you dip the bottom portion of the letter in water, revealing the code 747 MHz. Inputting the code 747 into the game allows the gameplay to proceed. And of course, without this code, you are stuck at this part of the game unable to continue. However, the game does give you an infinite amount of attempts, so you can simply try all 999 combinations of numbers until you get the right one. Now, whether you consider the StarTropics piece of paper in the water to be anti-piracy or not really is kind of up to your interpretation. Many people believe that it really was simply there to be more of a deterrent in the rental market, where Nintendo probably would have preferred to have sold as many copies as were rented of this game. But just like most early anti-piracy measures that involved a piece of paper that could be photocopied or duplicated, this result was also the same. Not only was the code the same across every single game, so there was no unique code per game, but it was just a matter of once you had discovered the code, then all you needed to do was write it down somewhere for safekeeping. As an example, I've seen cartridges with the code 747 scribbled on it or on the box or manual. Once the code is discovered, it's pointless and more of an annoyance than anything else. But on the flip side, I've heard stories of people renting the game and being unable to proceed because they weren't sure what the code was because the letter was either damaged or simply not available. What saves StarTropics is that the same code is used everywhere, and if it was different per game, then that would certainly pose a different challenge, especially in the rental market. In any case, 747 was known for years as the code for StarTropics. Even magazines of back in the day would publish the code for all to see. But what about in more recent times? We said that the game was brought forward to the Virtual Console, NES Classic, and NSO. Did Nintendo patch out the ROM so any code could be entered, effectively cracking the check? Well, no. Now, StarTropics was a game that also released for the Nintendo Virtual Console on the Wii, and Nintendo had the foresight to include a copy of this letter and the code itself in the operations manual of the game. A digital manual is provided for StarTropics and even includes a transcript of the actual letter itself, and when you click on the link, it shows the animation of the letter being dipped in water and the code appearing. And I gotta say, this is pretty neat. By 2016, with the launch of the NES Classic, Nintendo would provide a link for you to download all the digital manuals for the games on the NES Classic, and once again, with StarTropics, the code was available here. However, when it comes to more recent times and the Nintendo Switch Online service where StarTropics was added back in 2019, there was some confusion, basically wrong information presented by outlets that Nintendo had completely forgotten about the StarTropics code. And I'm here to tell you that that's actually not the case. The code has been provided by Nintendo, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below, but I will say that I'm not sure when Nintendo added this code to their website. It may have been something that was done after the fact when people started to ask questions about why StarTropic didn't have a code or what the code was, but in any case, Nintendo has seemingly covered all their bases here. I do find it curious that Nintendo themselves did not decide to patch the ROM and effectively just remove the check in of itself, because this is something that you can do with an Action Replay or a Game Genie cartridge from back in the day, and I feel like it would have been trivial for Nintendo just to patch out this particular piece of code. And at least as of the making of this episode, Nintendo has not patched any type of update into the game to help players out. Now, of course, you can just Google the code itself. It's 747. It's not the end of the world. It's certainly not something that I would consider traditional anti-piracy, because once you know the code, and it's pretty easy to just to Google the code itself, then you are good to proceed. Now, StarTropics 1 was not the only game that featured anti-piracy. In fact, Zuma's Revenge, the sequel, StarTropics 2, also came with an anti-piracy measure, albeit a more sophisticated one. In 1994, the sequel to StarTropics, known as Zoda's Revenge, was released in North America, once again developed by Nintendo R&D 3 in Japan. This would be the final game developed by Nintendo exclusively for the NES, and once again would feature Mike Jones in a brand new adventure. This game features 9 chapters of adventure where you decipher codes, solve mysteries, battle dragons, in an epic journey through time and space. Overall, Zoda's Revenge is a bigger and more ambitious sequel. What you may not know about Zoda's Revenge is that it also contains a form of anti-piracy within the game. Gone is the letter in the water gimmick replaced with a more traditional form of anti-piracy. When the game is plugged in and turned on, it performs a checksum against the title and data and determines if anything has been tampered. Usually when bootlegs are made, a title screen or something is altered. If this test fails, the game simply starts to flash between black and white. This is very similar to when the 10 NES lockout chip determines a bootleg and simply resets the NES over and over again. It also simulates a cartridge that hasn't been plugged in correctly. But in this instance, the game isn't being locked out, it's simply being simulated in this way. And if you let the game flash between black and white, eventually after about 5 minutes or so, it does throw you into the game. There are also certain areas of code that are selected randomly and executed just as you're about to start a new chapter of the game. This anti-piracy check kicks in from chapter 5. If the block of code does not match what's expected, the anti-piracy check will fail and dump you back to chapter 2, unable to complete the game. Now, this more traditional form of anti-piracy was put in place because it was the time where disc copiers started to become more popular, and having this additional level of copy protection meant that this game would not be playable on anything other than original hardware with the original game. But in conclusion, both StarTropics 1 and StarTropics 2 contained interesting forms of anti-piracy. Whether you believe StarTropics 1's letter in the water was anti-piracy is certainly up for interpretation. But in the end, I have a lot of love for both StarTropics 1 and StarTropics 2. Everything about these games, including the letter gimmick, is something that is just bathed in nostalgia for me. So if you are interested in playing a really cool set of action-adventure games from the early 90s, then you could do a lot worse than checking out StarTropics 1 and 2.